Please take your seats so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 1 of Basic Human Anatomy, the Introduction. After completing this lesson, you should be able to define anatomy, the anatomical position, and different kinds of anatomical studies. You should be able to provide at least one good reason for studying anatomical terminology. You should be able to characterize the three types of body build and understand their clinical significance. You should be able to trace the organization of the human body into cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and the total organism. I expect you to be able to list the parts of the upper and lower members and name the different anatomical planes and directions. Finally, after studying this material, you should be able to define the cell and match names of major cell components with drawings representing them. Anatomy is the study of the structure of the body. In contrast, physiology is the study of the functions of the body. No two human beings are built exactly alike, but we can group individuals into three major categories. These groups represent basic body shapes. They're called ectomorph, endomorph, and mesomorph. Morph means body or body form. Ecto means all energy is outgoing, so an ectomorph means a slim individual. Endo means all energy is stored inside, so an endomorph is a broad individual. Meso means in between or in the middle, so a mesomorph body type between the two others is a muscular type. Ectomorphs, slim persons, are more susceptible to lung infections. Endomorphs are more susceptible to heart disease. I'd like to say a few words about terminology. Each profession and each science has its own language. Lawyers have legal terminology. Physicians and other medical professions and occupations have medical terminology, and educators have objectives, domains, and curricula. To work in a legal field, you should know the meaning of quid pro quo. To work in a medical field, you should know the meanings of terms such as proximal, distal, sagittal, femur, humerus, thorax, and cerebellum. There are several kinds of anatomic studies. Microscopic anatomy is the study of structures that cannot be seen with the unaided eye. You need a microscope. Gross anatomy by systems is the study of organ systems such as the respiratory system or the digestive system. Gross anatomy by regions considers anatomy in terms of regions such as the trunk, the upper member, or lower member. Neuroanatomy studies the nervous system. Functional anatomy is the study of relationships between functions and structures. The human body is organized into cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and the total organism. Cells are the smallest living unit of body construction. A tissue is a grouping of similar cells working together. Examples would be muscle tissue and nervous tissue. An organ is a structure composed of several different tissues performing a particular function. Examples would include the lungs and the heart. Organ systems are groups of organs which together perform an overall function. Examples would be the respiratory system and the digestive system. The total organism is the individual human being. You are a total organism. The human body is a single total composite. Everything works together. Each part acts in association with all other parts, yet it is also a series of regions. Each region is responsible for certain body activities. These three regions are called the torso, the head and neck, and the arms and legs. The torso includes the back and the trunk. The trunk includes the thorax or chest and abdomen. At the lower end of the trunk is the pelvis. The perineum is the portion of the body forming the floor of the pelvis. The lungs, the heart, and the digestive system are found in the trunk. The second region comprises the head and neck. The brain, eyes, ears, mouth, pharynx, and larynx are found in this region. The third region, the arms and legs, are also called members. Each upper member includes a shoulder, an arm, a forearm, a wrist, and a hand. Each lower member includes a hip, a thigh, a leg, an ankle, and a foot. As I mentioned earlier, you must know the language of a particular field to be successful in it. Each field has specific names for specific structures and functions. Unless you know the names and their meanings, you'll have trouble saying what you mean. You'll have trouble understanding what others are saying. You won't be able to communicate well. A scientific term is a word that names or gives special information about a structure or process. Some scientific terms have 2 or 3 different parts. These parts are known as a prefix, a root, and a suffix. Consider the word subcutaneous. Subcutaneous means below the skin. Sub means below, so sub is the prefix. Cutis means skin. Cutis is the root. Subcutaneous. A second example is the word myocardium. Myocardium means the muscular wall of the heart. Myo means muscle, so myo is the prefix. Cardium means heart, so cardium is the root. A third example is the word tonsillitis. Tonsil is the root, itis is the suffix, and it means inflammation. So tonsillitis means inflammation of the tonsils. The anatomical position is an artificial posture of the human body. This position is used as a standard reference throughout the medical profession. We always speak of the parts of the body as if the body were in the anatomical position. This is true regardless of what position the body is actually in. In the anatomical position, the body stands erect with heels together. Upper members are along the sides with the palms of the hands facing forward. The head faces forward. The reason this is important is that the heart is always considered to be located above the diaphragm, regardless of whether the person is sitting at a table or hanging upside down. Sometimes we look at cross-sections of the human body to better understand anatomy. These cross-sections are called planes of the body. There are three basic ones: sagittal planes, horizontal planes, and frontal planes. Sagittal planes are vertical planes that pass through the body from front to back. The median or mid-sagittal plane is the vertical plane that divides the body into right and left halves. Horizontal or transverse planes are parallel to the floor. They are perpendicular to both the sagittal and the frontal planes. The frontal or coronal planes are vertical planes which pass through the body from side to side. They are perpendicular to the sagittal plane. Now let's talk for a few minutes about body directions. Superior means above. Inferior means below. The heart is above the diaphragm, so it is superior to it. The stomach is below the diaphragm, so we would say the stomach is inferior to the diaphragm. Anterior refers to the front of the body. A commonly used substitute word is ventral. A ventral hernia means a hernia that is located on the front of the body or the anterior side of the body. Posterior refers to the back of the body. A commonly used substitute word is dorsal. The dorsal fin on a shark arises from the shark's back. Medial means toward or nearer the midline of the body. The nose is medial to the ears. Lateral means away from the midline or toward the side of the body. The ears are lateral to the nose. Superficial means closer to the surface of the body. A superficial wound means one that is just on the surface of the skin. Deep means towards the center of the body or body part. A deep wound means one that penetrates well below the skin surface. Proximal and distal are terms applied specifically to the limbs. Proximal means nearer to the shoulder joint or the hip joint. Distal means further away from the shoulder joint or hip joint. Sometimes proximal and distal are used to identify the beginning and the end of the GI tract, that portion closer to the stomach being proximal, while that being further away is distal. Names are chosen to describe the structure or process as much as possible. An international nomenclature was adopted for anatomy in Paris in 1955. It does not use the names of people for any structures, with the single exception of the Achilles tendon at the back of the foot and ankle. Names are chosen to identify structures properly. Names identify structures according to shape, size, color, function, and/or location. Some examples would be these. We all have two trapezius muscles in our backs, one on each side, connecting our spine to our shoulders. The word trapezius means trapezoid-shaped, like a rectangle with two parallel sides and two non-parallel sides. Each leg has an adductor magnus muscle, connecting the thigh bone to the pelvis. Ad means toward, duct means to carry, and magnus means very large. Erythrocyte is a red blood cell. Erythro means red in color, and cyte means cell. Speaking of cells, a cell is the microscopic unit of a body organization. A typical animal cell includes a cell membrane, a nucleus, a nuclear membrane, a cytoplasm, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, centrioles, and lysosomes, and I'll talk a little bit about each of them. The nucleus plays a central role in the cell. Information is stored in the nucleus and distributed to guide the life processes of the cell. This information is in a chemical form called nucleic acids. Two types of structures found in the nucleus are chromosomes and nucleoli. Chromosomes can be seen clearly only during cell divisions. Chromosomes are composed of both nucleic acid and protein. Chromosomes contain genes. Genes are the basic units of heredity which are passed from parents to their children. Genes guide the activities of each individual cell. The cell membrane surrounds and separates the cell from its environment. The cell membrane allows materials to pass through it as they enter or leave the cell. The fluid-like material that is found inside the cell but outside the nucleus is called the cytoplasm. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. The mitochondria provide the energy wherever it is needed for carrying on the cellular functions. The endoplasmic reticulum is a network of membranes, cavities, and canals. The endoplasmic reticulum helps in the transfer of materials from one part of the cell to the other. Ribosomes are protein factories in the cell. They are composed mainly of nucleic acids, which help them make proteins according to instructions provided by the genes. Centrioles help in the process of cell division. Lysosomes are membrane-bound spheres which contain enzymes that can digest intracellular structures or bacteria. Individual cells have fairly specific lifespans. Some types of cells have longer lifespans than others. During the process of growth and repair, new cells are being formed. The usual process of cell multiplication is called mitosis. There are two important factors to consider. From one cell, we get two new cells. And second, the genes of the new cells are identical for all practical purposes. They are identical to the genes of the original cell. Finally, I'd like to talk about the terms hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Hypertrophy and hyperplasia are two ways by which the cell mass of the body increases. With hypertrophy, there's an increase in the size of the individual cells. No new cells are formed. An example of this would be the enlargement of muscles due to exercise by the increased diameter of the individually striated muscle cells. With hyperplasia, there's an increase in the total number of cells. An example of abnormal hyperplasia would be cancer. Atrophy is seen where there is a loss of cell mass, either because of loss of numbers of cells or loss of cell volume. This concludes Lesson 1. Look over the lecture notes and study the illustrations, particularly the regions of the human body, the anatomical planes, and the typical animal cell structure. Then you'll be ready to take the optional exam. I'll see you later for Lesson 2, the tissues of the body. Please take your seats so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 2 of the Basic Human Anatomy course. After completing this lesson, you should be able to define tissue and name the four major types of tissues. You should be able to define epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. If I were to give you a description of a tissue, you should be able to correctly name it. After completing this lesson, you should be able to name the four major types of connective tissue, name the characteristic cells of fibrous, cartilage, and bone connective tissue, and you should be able to describe the matrix of fibrous, cartilage, and fat connective tissue. A tissue is a grouping of similar cells working together. There are several major types of tissue. The most common types are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissues. Later, I'll discuss each type. Tissues make up organs. An organ is a structure performing a particular function. An organ is composed of several different tissues. Examples of organs are the lungs and the heart. In some cases, a term may be used to describe both a type of tissue and a kind of organ. For example, we speak of bone tissue and we also speak of bones. We speak of muscle tissue and of muscles. Epithelial tissue is tissue that covers surfaces and lines cavities. Here it may protect, absorb, and/or secrete. Epithelial tissue covers the outer surface of the body. It lines the intestines, it lines the lungs, and other hollow organs. The three basic types of epithelial cells are flat, cubes, and column-shaped. The flat cells are called squamous cells, the cubes are called cuboidal cells, and the columns are called columnar cells. In epithelial tissues, the cells are in single or multiple layers. If there's only one layer, the tissue is called a simple epithelium. If there is more than one layer, the tissue is called a stratified epithelium. Epithelial tissues are named by the number of layers and the type of cell in its outermost layer. For example, if there are several layers and if the outermost layer consists of squamous or flat cells, then the tissue is called a stratified squamous epithelium. Skin is a stratified squamous epithelium. A simple squamous epithelium called endothelium lines the heart and the blood vessels. As serous membranes, simple squamous epithelial tissue lines the cavities of the abdomen, that's called the peritoneal lining, and the chest, and that's called the pleural lining. Serous membranes are membranes which secrete a lubricating fluid. Epithelial tissue forms the secretory parts of glands and also parts of the various sense organs. According to its location, epithelial tissue has different functions. As the skin, epithelial tissue protects the tissues beneath. In the small intestines, the epithelial tissue absorbs. In the lungs, epithelial tissue is a membrane through which the gases pass easily. In the glands, epithelial tissue secretes. Connective tissue is tissue that supports other tissues. It holds tissues together or fills spaces. Among and outside the cells of the connective tissues, there is a material called matrix. The matrix is manufactured by the connective tissue cells. Each type of connective tissue has its own particular type of matrix. There are several major types of connective tissue. These include fibrous connective tissue, cartilage, bone, and fat connective tissue. Blood is sometimes considered an additional type of connective tissue. The characteristic cells of fibrous connective tissue are called fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are able to form elongated fibers. Fibers make up the matrix of fibrous connective tissue. The fibers are either white or yellow. White fibers are made from a protein called collagen. White fibers tend to have a fixed length. White fibers are not very easily stretched. Yellow fibers are made from a protein called elastin. Yellow fibers are elastic. They can be stretched and then they can snap back like a rubber band. The types of fibrous connective tissue are recognized by the arrangement of their fibers. These types include loose areolar fibrous connective tissue and dense fibrous connective tissue. The word areolar means airy. Loose areolar fibrous connective tissue has an open, irregular arrangement of its fibers. Loose areolar fibroconnective tissue is found widely throughout the body. An example is the superficial fascia or the subcutaneous layer. The superficial fascia is the connective tissue which lies beneath the skin. Loose areolar fibrous connective tissue is the filling substance around most organs and tissues of the body. The fibers of dense fibrous connective tissue are closely packed in parallel. There are no significant spaces between these fibers. Examples of dense fibrous connective tissue are ligaments and tendons. A ligament is a band of dense fibrous connective tissue that holds the bones together at a joint. A tendon attaches a muscle to a bone. Cartilage cells are also called chondroblasts. Cartilage cells are clustered in microscopic pockets within the cartilage matrix. The cartilage cells produce the material of the matrix. The matrix produced by the cartilage cells appears homogeneous, in other words, it appears the same throughout. The matrix also appears amorphous or shapeless. There are three types of cartilaginous connective tissue: hyaline cartilage, fibrous cartilage, and calcified cartilage. Hyaline means clear. Hyaline cartilage connective tissue appears homogeneous and clear. This type of cartilage helps to cover bone surfaces at joints. Hyaline cartilage is found as incomplete rings which keep the trachea or windpipe open. Fibrous cartilage connective tissue includes dense masses of fibers. It is more rigid than hyaline cartilage. The auricle of the external ear is stiffened with fibrous cartilage. Calcified cartilage connective tissue is cartilage that has been stiffened by the addition of calcium salts. This is not the same as bone tissue. An example is the cartilages of the larynx or the voice box, which has become calcified with age. Osteoblasts are cells that make and repair bone. Osteoclasts are cells which tear down and remove bone. Bone is continually being remodeled as a person lives. Remodeling is in direct response to the stresses placed on the bone. There are two major types of bone tissue. One is compact bone connective tissue, which is dense. The other is cancellous bone connective tissue, which is spongy. Compact bone connective tissue forms the hard outer layers of bones. Cancellous bone connective tissue forms the inner, lighter portion of bones. A large fraction of the volume of a fat cell is occupied by a droplet of fat. This droplet has its own membrane in addition to the outer membrane of the cell. The remaining components of the fat cell, including the nucleus, are found in the outer layer of cytoplasm surrounding the droplet of fat. Fat connective tissue has a matrix of lipid. Lipid means oil or fat. There may be yellow fat connective tissue or brown fat connective tissue. Fat connective tissue acts as a packing material among the organs, nerves, and vessels. Fat connective tissue also helps to insulate the body from both heat and cold. Some fat connective tissue serves as a high-energy storage area. Some experts consider blood to be a type of connective tissue, but I'll talk about blood in Lesson 9. There are muscle tissues and there are organs called muscles. Muscles are made up of muscle tissues. Muscle tissues and the muscles they make up are specialized to contract. Because of their ability to contract or shorten, muscles are able to produce motion. There are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. The cells or muscle fibers of skeletal muscle tissue are long and cylindrical and have numerous nuclei. The arrangement of the cellular contents is very specific and results in a striated appearance when viewed with the microscope. This type of muscle tissue is found mainly in the skeletal muscles. The cells or muscle fibers of cardiac muscle tissue are short, branched, and contain one nucleus and are striated. This tissue makes up the myocardium or the wall of the heart. The cells of smooth muscle tissue are spindle-shaped, contain one nucleus, and are not striated. Smooth muscle tissue is generally found in the walls of hollow organs such as the organs of digestion and respiratory systems, the blood vessels, the ureters, the urinary bladder, urethra, and reproductive ducts. Nervous tissue is a collection of cells that respond to stimuli and transmit information. A neuron or nerve cell is the cell of nervous tissue that actually picks up and transmits a signal from one part of the body to another. A synapse is the point at which a signal passes from one neuron to the next. The neuroglia, also known as glia, is made up of supporting cells of the nervous system or glial cells. I'll talk about the nervous tissues in a later session. This completes Lesson 2. You should review the lecture notes for this lesson, paying particular attention to the line drawing showing the different types of epithelial cells, the different types of muscle cells, and the structure of a nerve cell. Then you can take the self-evaluation exam. When you finish the exam, you'll be ready for Lesson 3, the human integumentary and fascial systems. Please take your seat so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 3 of the Basic Human Anatomy course. Today we'll be studying the human integumentary and fascial systems. I have 5 goals for you in this lesson. First, I want you to be able to define the terms integumentary system, integument proper, integumentary derivatives, fascia, superficial fascia or the subcutaneous layer, deep fascia, and investing deep fascia. Second, I want you to be able to identify the three coverings or envelopes of the human body. Third, I want you to be able to name and describe the two layers of the skin. Next, I want you to name and describe three types of integumentary derivatives such as hairs, glands, and nails. Lastly, I'd like you to be able to define serous cavities, be able to describe a bursa, and give examples of serous cavities in the body. An organ system is a group of organs which together perform an overall function. The integumentary system includes the integument proper and the integumentary derivatives. We know the integument proper as the skin. The skin is the outermost covering of the whole body. The integumentary derivatives include the hairs, nails, and various glands of the skin. A fascia is a sheet or collection of fibrous connective tissue. The superficial fascia is a connective tissue which lies immediately beneath the skin and is often known as a subcutaneous layer. Deep fascia form envelopes for muscles and other organs and fill spaces. One deep fascial membrane is the third envelope of the whole body, beneath the skin and the subcutaneous layer. It is known as the investing deep fascia. The entire body is surrounded by three layers or envelopes, one inside the other. These coverings separate the body from the external environment. From outside in, these envelopes include the skin, which is the integument proper, the subcutaneous layer, and the investing deep fascia. The integument proper is the outermost layer of the human body. It is usually known as the skin. The skin has two layers, the superficial or outer layer called the epidermis, and the deeper or inner layer called the dermis. The epidermis is a stratified squamous epithelium. This means that it is made up of several layers of cells, the outermost being flat-type epithelial cells. The outer layers of the epidermis include cells that are transparent, flattened, dead, and without nuclei. These hardened cells of the outermost layers are completely filled with keratin and are known as cornified cells. These dead, flat cells in the outermost layer resemble scales. Day by day, these cells are scraped away or just fall away from the body. They are replaced by cells from the intermediate layers. In the intermediate layers of the epidermis, the cells change their shapes. As the cells move towards the surface, they gain granules, begin to manufacture a hardening material called keratin, and lose their nuclei. The innermost layer of epidermis is especially important because it is the source of all the other layers of the epidermis. It is known as the basal or germinative layer. The cells of this layer are capable of multiplication, also called mitosis. Its basic structure is a single layer of columnar-type epithelial cells. The dermis is the layer of the skin lying just beneath the epidermis. It is dense fibroconnective tissue consisting of white and yellow fibers. This layer in animal hides is used to make leather. The dermis has finger-like projections called papillae. These papillae extend into the epidermis and keep the dermis and epidermis from sliding on each other. The dermal layer includes blood vessels, lymph vessels, nerve endings, hair follicles, and glands. The integumentary derivatives include the glands, hairs, and nails associated with the skin. All integumentary derivatives are formed from the tissues of the integument proper, the dermis and the epidermis. All are appended or attached to the integument proper and are often known as the appendages of the skin. A hair follicle is formed by the extension of the skin, dermis and epidermis, deeper into the surface of the body. Follicles may extend into the subcutaneous layer. At the base of the hair follicle is the hair root. The hair shaft grows out from the root. The hair shaft is made of cells from the outermost layers of the epidermis. Scalp and facial hairs grow continuously. Other hairs of the body grow to fixed lengths. The types and patterns of hairs are determined for each individual by genetics, including his or her gender. The types of glands included are the sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, and the mammary glands. The ducts and secretory parts of these glands are made up of epithelial tissues. Backup or supporting tissue is made of fibrous connective tissue. Sweat glands consist of a coiled secretory portion and a wavy duct which leads to the surface of the skin. The coiled secretory portion is located in the dermis or deeper. Sweat glands are found everywhere in the body in association with the skin. Sebaceous glands produce an oily substance which lubricates the skin and hairs. The oil keeps the skin and hairs flexible. The sebaceous glands are usually found as a part of the walls of hair follicles, and their oil flows into the follicle. In a few places without hairs, they open directly to the skin surface. In the adult human female, the mammary gland lies in the subcutaneous layer anterior to the chest muscle. Its function is to nourish the newborn. A nipple is located near the center of each breast. Around each nipple is a darkened area known as the areola. The tip of the nipple has many small openings to allow the passage of milk from the milk ducts. These ducts are connected to lobes of glandular tissue located throughout the breast. Fat and fibrous connective tissue fill in the spaces among the lobes. Nails are found on the ends of the digits, the thumbs, fingers, and toes. Nails help to protect the ends of these digits. Each nail bed is attached to the top of the terminal phalanx or bone of each digit. The nail itself is made up of cornified or hardened outer cell layers of the epidermis. The nails grow continuously from their roots. The skin includes red, black, and yellow pigments. The proportion of these pigments determines the skin color. This proportion is determined by genetics. The absence of all pigments is called albinism. In albinism, white light is reflected and a pink hue results from the color of the blood shining through the transparent skin. These pigments are the source of hair color as well as the skin color. Most of the fibrous connective tissues are fascial. These may occur as sheets or masses. Not included in this definition are the tendons, ligaments, or aponeuroses, the wide flat tendons. The different fascia have varying proportions of white fibers, yellow fibers, fat, and tissue fluid. Some serve as membranes to enclose the body and its parts. Fascia also help to support some organs and allow motions between other organs to be easier. The superficial fascia is the second envelope of the body. It is the layer between the skin, the integument proper, and the investing deep fascial envelope. It is often called the subcutaneous layer, but it is technically not part of the integumentary system as such. The superficial fascia is made up primarily of loose areolar fibrous connective tissue, with the spaces filled by fatty tissue and tissue fluid. It contains the superficial or cutaneous branches of nerves, arteries, veins, and lymphatics of the skin. These four components can be remembered through the use of the acronym NAVL, N-A-V-L, for nerves, arteries, veins, and lymphatics. The deep fascia includes various membranes made of consolidated or dense fibrous connective tissue. A deep fascia envelops the entire body as the third envelope. This third envelope is known as the investing deep fascia. It is beneath the skin and subcutaneous layer. Deep fascia also include the envelopes of the muscles and other organs. Around individual organs, for example, the kidney, it is called a capsule. Another form of deep fascia is found in the collections of loose areolar fibrous connective tissue and fat that are found as filling among the organs. Similar deep fascia attach organs to the body wall. The term serous refers to a watery type fluid. Serous cavities are sacs lined with serous membranes. These cavities serve as lubricating devices. They reduce the friction during the motion between organs. A bursa is the simplest of serous cavities. Each bursa is a small sac located between two moving structures, usually a muscle moving over a bony surface. The bursa reduces the friction between the two structures. For example, a bursa prevents excessive friction between the skin and the patella or kneecap. This bursa, called the prepatellar bursa, allows the skin to move freely over the patella. When injured, it produces excessive amounts of serous fluid and is known as housemaid's knee. As a fibrous sac, each bursa has a central cavity which is lined with a serous membrane. This membrane is a simple squamous epithelium. The serous membrane secretes a serous fluid into the serous cavity. The serous fluid is the lubricant, minimizing friction. Other important serous cavities are associated with the major hollow organs, referred to as visceral organs. Each lung is encased in a serous cavity called the pleural cavity. The heart lies in a serous cavity called the pericardial cavity. The intestines are allowed to move freely during the digestive processes within the peritoneal cavity. Each serous cavity has an inner and an outer membrane. The inner membrane is intimately associated with the surface of the visceral organ. The outer membrane forms the outer wall of the cavity. The serous lining of the cavity secretes the serous fluid into the cavity to act as a lubricant between the membranes, allowing freer motion for the organs. This is the end of Lesson 3. Please read through the lecture notes and review the diagrams, particularly the skin anatomy and appendages. Also review the drawing of the bursa. Then you will be ready to take the optional exam. In our next Please take your seat so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 4, where we learn more about the skeletal system. After completing this lesson, you should be able to define the word skeleton and name the 4 functions of the human skeleton. You should be able to name the layers and describe the basic structure of an individual bone. You should be able to name and describe the parts of an individual long bone and describe the periosteum and the blood supply of an individual bone. You'll be able to describe the development of an individual bone and name 4 types of bones by shape. I expect you to name and define the 2 major subdivisions of the skeleton. I want you to know how to describe the thoracic cage and the skull. You should be able to describe the general pattern of the bones of the upper and lower members. I want you to be able to describe a typical vertebra, name the regions of the vertebral column, and give the number of vertebrae in each region. You'll have the capability of describing the intervertebral discs and ligaments that hold the vertebrae together. We'll also talk about joints. You should be able to describe major categories used in the classification of joints. You should be able to name the major parts of a typical synovial joint and also name and describe classifications of synovial joints according to the kind of motion and the number of axes. The skeleton serves as a support or framework of the human body. It's a combination of bones joined together. The human skeleton has 4 major functions: support, protection, motion, and hematopoiesis. For bodily support, the skeletal system provides a framework for the human body. For protection, the skeleton protects certain soft structures within the human body. An example is the skull, which surrounds the brain. For motion, muscles are attached to and move the bones. Bones provide leverage for motion. And for formation of blood cells, also known as hematopoiesis, blood cells are manufactured in the red bone marrow, mainly found in flat bones. In this lesson, we study the skeletal system from 4 different viewpoints: tissues, individual organs, joints, and the skeleton as a whole. Since we've already discussed bone as a tissue in Lesson 2, I'm not going to dwell on this topic today. For bones as individual organs, we'll cover this momentarily. We'll cover the study of joints later in the session, and our last topic today will be a discussion of the human skeleton as a whole in terms of its major subdivisions. The body uses bony tissues to form an individual bone. First, there's the cortex. The cortex is the outer layer of an individual bone. It's made up of compact or dense bony tissue. Second, there's the medulla. The medulla is the central portion of the individual bone. It generally consists of cancellous or spongy bone tissue. In some bones, particularly long bones, the medulla may include a space without any bony tissue. This space is called the medullary or marrow cavity. The marrow serves as a filler of the inside of bones. There are 2 types of bone marrow, yellow and red. Yellow bone marrow is mostly fat tissue. Red bone marrow is the only site in adults for the formation of red blood cells, known as hematopoiesis. The shaft is the central portion of a long bone. Here the cortex is thickened as required by applied physical stresses. The ends of long bones are made up mainly of cancellous or spongy bone tissue. An articular cartilage covers each area where a bone contacts another bone. This articular cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage tissue and provides a smooth surface for motions. The periosteum is a covering of the bone surface not covered by articular cartilage. Periosteum is well supplied with blood vessels and sensory-type nervous tissue. It has 2 layers, the innermost layer and the fibrous layer. The innermost layer, which lies against the outer surface of the bone, consists of bone-forming cells, also known as osteoblasts. This is the osteogenic or bone-forming layer. The outermost layer is a fibrous connective tissue layer. A system of blood vessels enters and spreads out through the periosteum. Additional blood vessels, called nutrient vessels, penetrate the cortex of the bone and spread out through the marrow. The passageways for penetration of these vessels are called the nutrient canals. The human skeleton is pre-formed in the early fetus, but the early form is not of bony material. There are two types of bones according to their pre-formed basis. There's membranous bones and cartilage bones. These are in the right location and have the general shape of the adult bones they will become later. The outer skull bones are an example of membranous bones. Osteoblasts invade a membrane to form a center of ossification for formation of bone. Bone-forming activity spreads out from this center until a full bone is formed. In the fetus, many bones, for example long bones, exist first as models formed of cartilage. Sesamoid bones are small masses of bone that develop in tendons at points where great forces are applied to the tendons. The most obvious and largest sesamoid bone is the patella or kneecap. An ossification center is a growing mass of actual bone within the preformed material. Initial bone formation involves destruction of the preforming material and replacement with bony tissue. In the development of the long bones, there are two types of ossification centers. There's the diaphyseal, which is in the shaft region, and there's the epiphyseal, which is in the ends. As a long bone grows in length, the preforming material grows faster than the ossification center can tear it down. Ultimately, with time, the preforming material is overcome and growth ceases. A bone grows wider through the activity of the osteogenic layer of the periosteum. Remember, the periosteum covers most of the outer surface of the bone. Bones of the skeleton can be grouped into four major types: long, short, flat, and irregular. Each type has a somewhat different construction pattern. A femur is an example of a long bone. The short bones, such as those of the wrist and feet, have a thin layer of compact bone surrounding an inner mass of spongy bone. An example of these would be carpal bones of the wrist. The flat bones are constructed with two plates of compact bone, which enclose between them a layer of spongy bone. The spongy bone is richly supplied with blood vessels and red marrow. An example of a flat bone is the cranial frontal bone. The irregular bones are those that are not long, short, or flat. In other words, everything else. An example of an irregular bone is a vertebra. A joint or articulation is the location where two or more bones meet. Joints are classified according to the kind of material holding the bones together and the relative freedom and kind of motion at the particular joint. Varying degrees of motion, from none to some, are possible in fibrous joints. An example of this type of joint would be the inferior tibiofibular joint. When the bones are held together by fibrous connective tissue, the joint is referred to as syndesmosis. Syn means together, and desmos means a fiber, so syndesmosis is when the bones are held together by fibrous connective tissue. A suture is when the bones are quite close together with a minimum amount of fibrous connective tissue. For example, the joints between the cranial bones are known as sutures. Should the bones be united by bony material, the joint is referred to as a synostosis. An example is the frontal bone. The frontal bone of the skull is actually a bony fusion of two bones. Approximately 10% of the time, this fusion fails to take place. The original suture between the bones remains and is called a metopic suture. Syn again means together, osteo means bones, so synostosis means bones together. Cartilaginous joints are also non-movable joints. A cartilage joint in which the bones are held together by hyaline cartilage is called a synchondrosis. An example is the epiphyseal plate. Syn means together, chondro means cartilage. A symphysis is a cartilaginous joint in which the bones are held together by a disc of fibrocartilage. An example of this would be the pubic symphysis. In the synovial type of joints, the bones move on one another so as to allow various motions of the body parts. The ovial part of the name refers to the fact that the fluid substance seen in this type of joint appears to the old anatomist to be like raw egg. Ovum means egg. A typical synovial joint is one which has parts common to all of the synovial joints. It is not actually a specific synovial joint. It's a composite. It's illustrated in the figure, and the typical synovial joint has bones, articular cartilages, synovial membrane, space, and fluid. It has a capsule, ligaments, and muscle. Bones are the levers of motion. They are the site of attachment for skeletal muscles. The contact points of the bones are usually covered with a layer of lubricated cartilage. Where these cartilages end, the synovial membrane begins. Cartilages provide a smooth surface to reduce friction. The synovial membrane lines the inner surface of the capsule. It secretes synovial fluid into the synovial space. The drawing exaggerates the amount of space between the bones. The space within the capsule allows movement. Synovial fluid is a colorless, viscous fluid similar in consistency to raw egg white. It lubricates the articulation. The typical synovial articulation is surrounded by a sleeve of dense fibrous connective tissue known as the capsule. The capsule encloses the articulation. Primarily, ligaments hold the bones together. Ligaments also may help restrain motion in certain directions and stabilize the articulation. Skeletal muscles apply the forces to produce a given motion. Synovial joints are further classified according to the kind of motion and the number of axes the motions used. In uniaxial synovial joints, motion occurs in only one plane. The joints of the fingers, the interphalangeal joints, flex and extend in the sagittal plane. These are commonly referred to as hinge joints. If a single rotary or rotational motion occurs around a post-like structure, the joint is a pivot joint. The atlas vertebra rotating around the dens, which is a tooth-like projection, of the axis vertebra at the top of the neck or the base of the skull, is a pivot joint. In biaxial synovial joints, motion between the bones occurs in two planes. Here, the surface in contact is curved or rounded in two directions. The proximal phalanx of the finger can flex and extend and move from side to side on the rounded head of the metacarpal bone. This is the MP, or metacarpophalangeal joint. When the two surfaces are curved in directions at right angles to each other, a shape similar to that of a cowboy's saddle is formed. This type of synovial joint is called a saddle joint. In the human body, the saddle joint is located at the base of the thumb. In multiaxial joints, motion is possible in all three planes of space. The ball and socket type synovial joint has the freest motion in all directions. A spherically rounded head fits into a receiving concavity. The head is called the ball, the concavity is called the socket. The hip joint is an example of the ball and socket type, with the spherical head of the femur fitting into the cup or socket of the pelvic bone. In the plane joint, contact surfaces of the bones are essentially flat. These flat surfaces slide on one another. This is also called translatory motion. The acromioclavicular joint of the shoulder region is another example of a plane joint. In three of the synovial joints of the human body, a special addition is seen. This addition is known as an articular disc. The joints with articular discs are the temporomandibular joint of the lower jaw, the sternoclavicular joint at the sternum or the breastbone, and the ulnocarpal joint of the distal end of the forearm. An articular disc is a fibrocartilage plate. It's inserted between the articular surfaces of the bones as a synovial joint. In this way, it divides the synovial space into two spaces. Joints having an articular disc are capable of having several different motions occurring at the same time. Mechanically, there are really two joints there. The human skeleton is a collection of individual bones articulated or joined together. The major subdivisions of the skeleton are the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the central framework of the human body. It includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. The vertebral column, or spine, is made up of a vertical series of bony blocks called vertebrae. These vertebrae are joined together in such a way as to form a semi-flexible rod. The spine is the center support for the trunk, yet allows trunk movements. Anatomically and functionally, a typical vertebra is constructed of two major parts. The vertebral body is a drum-shaped cylindrical mass. Its superior and inferior surfaces are flat. Its function is primarily weight-bearing. The neural arch extends posteriorly, arching over and protecting the spinal cord of the central nervous system. From the neural arch are several processes. These processes serve as attachment areas for the trunk muscles. They also act as levers during various trunk motions. The vertebral column has 32 to 33 vertebrae, one on top of the other. These vertebrae are arranged in 5 regions: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and the coccyx. The vertebrae of each region have a characteristic shape. In the cervical region, there are 7 cervical vertebrae. In the thoracic region, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. In the lumbar region, there are 5 lumbar vertebrae, and the sacrum is a bony fusion of 5 sacral vertebrae. The coccyx has 3 to 4 coccygeal vertebrae altogether. The vertebrae are held together in 2 ways. The intervertebral disc holds the bodies of adjacent vertebrae together. The intervertebral disc is a fibrous ring with a soft center. This disc allows the vertebral bodies to move on one another. This joint between the vertebral bodies is a plane-type joint. The various parts of adjacent vertebrae are held together by ligaments. A ligament is a dense Please take your seat so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 5, where we learn more about the muscular system. After completing this lesson, you should be able to describe the general features of the skeletal muscles and the general arrangement of the trunk and limb musculature. If I were to give you a sample drawing, I would expect you to successfully identify the class of lever. I would want you to be able to name the components of a skeletal muscular unit. Given a description of a muscle's role in motion, name that role. The cellular elements of muscle tissues are specialized to produce motion by contraction. They also produce body heat. Smooth muscle tissue is utilized to make up the muscular portion of the various visceral organs such as the stomach, blood vessels, and others. Cardiac muscle tissue makes up the muscular wall of the heart, the myocardium. Striated muscle tissue is used in the makeup of several types of muscle. The main type of muscle is the skeletal muscle. Other types of muscles made with striated muscle tissue are the facial or integumentary muscles and the muscles of the jaw apparatus. Each skeletal muscle is an individual organ of the human body. Each is made up of several types of tissues, mainly striated muscle fibers and fibrous connective tissue. Each is attached to and moves bones. Bones are part of the skeleton, serving as levers. The large portion of a muscle is known as its belly or fleshy belly. This muscle is attached to bones by tendons or aponeuroses. Tendons and aponeuroses are similar to each other. However, tendons are cord-like and aponeuroses are broad and flat. The fleshy portion may be directly connected to the bone. If so, it is called a fleshy attachment. From the main nerve, artery, vein, and lymphatic, there are branches going to each muscle. These muscular branches are bound together by a fibrous connective tissue sheath to form a neurovascular bundle. The motor point is that specific location on the surface of the muscle where the neurovascular bundle enters. A motor unit is the single motor neuron and the number of striated muscle fibers activated by it. This is called innervation. The importance of the motor unit is that its fibers work in unison. Either all fibers within a unit contract or none of them contract. When a certain amount of force is needed, one unit after another is recruited until just enough units are available to produce the desired action. The name of a muscle may appear with the abbreviation M, meaning musculus or muscle. The abbreviation of muscles, the plural form, is the symbol MM. Skeletal muscles are named according to their physical attributes, in other words, their shape, size, length, location, or function. For example, the deltoid muscle takes its name from delta, the Greek letter for D. The biceps muscle comes from the Greek term biceps, which means two heads. The adductor magnus muscle comes from the Greek magnus, meaning great or large. The adductor longus muscle takes its name from longus, which is Greek for long. The biceps brachii muscle indicates the location of the muscle in the arm. The biceps femoris muscle is located in the femoris, or the thigh. The rotatorus muscles come from the Greek term rotatoris, or rotators. These muscles turn or rotate the vertebral column. The trunk musculature is arranged in two ways, longitudinal muscles and oblique muscles. Together they maintain the trunk posture, they move the parts of the trunk, and they adjust the internal pressures of the trunk to perform certain functions such as breathing. The limb musculature is arranged around the joints to produce the appropriate motions of the limbs. Elementary mechanics are described in the next section to help you understand typical arrangements of limb musculature. Muscles and bones together work like machines within the laws of physics and chemistry. Lever and pulley systems are examples of simple machines found commonly in the human body. There are three classes of levers, first, second, and third. In a first-class lever, the weight to be moved is at one end of the lever. The applied force is at the other end, and the fulcrum, in other words the pivot or turning point, is between the two. In a second-class lever, The weight to be moved is between the applied force and the fulcrum. This type of lever enables a weight to be moved with less force than would be required without a lever. Some people feel that there are no second-class levers in the human body. In the third-class lever, the weight to be moved is at one end of the lever, the fulcrum is at the other end, and the applied force is between the weight and the fulcrum. This type of lever provides speed, but a greater amount of force is required for a given weight. This is the most common type of lever in the human body. In the human body, when the tendon of a skeletal muscle slides over a round bony surface, the system acts like a simple pulley. A simple pulley provides a change in the direction of the force or muscle pull. There is no change in the amount of force produced by the muscle. For example, the knee acts as a simple pulley by which the quadriceps femoris muscle extends the leg. Sesamoid bones, such as the patella or kneecap, develop in tendons where pressure is applied to the tendon. The skeletal muscular unit is a working concept of a muscle and skeleton producing motion. Components of a skeletal muscular unit are bones, a joint, and skeleton muscles. Bones act as levers and as attachment sites for skeletal muscles. Joints are the center, the fulcrum point, or axis of motion. Skeletal muscles apply the forces for motion. Any given motion utilizes a group of muscles working together. A skeletal muscle may serve only one of the three following major roles during a particular motion. Prime mover is the first. The muscle which makes the main effort for a given motion is called the prime mover or agonist. Synergist is the second. A synergist is a muscle which assists the prime mover. Syn means together, and erg is a unit of effort. The third is antagonist. An antagonist applies a force opposite to that of the prime mover. By opposing the prime mover, the antagonist helps control the motion. The antagonist also brings the limb or other part back to its original position. This completes Lesson 5. Before continuing, you should carefully study the images in the lecture notes, particularly the names of the major muscles. It's important for all medical professionals to have a working knowledge of these names. Then, when you are ready, test your knowledge by taking the self-assessment test. On successful completion of the self-assessment test, you are ready to move on to Lesson 6, the human digestive system. Please take your seats so we can get started. Welcome back. Today we'll embark on Lesson 6, where we'll study the human digestive system. After completing this lesson, you should be able to define the human digestive system and name 6 major organs. I want you to be able to name and describe 6. Move on to Lesson 7, the human respiratory system and breathing. Please take your seats so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 7 of the Basic Human Anatomy course. Today we'll be studying the human respiratory system. I have 4 goals for you in this lesson. First, I want you to be able to define respiration, external respiration, internal respiration, and breathing. Second, I'd like you to be able to identify the main subdivisions of the respiratory system and their functions. You should be able to describe the external nose, nasal chambers, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, alveoli, lungs, and pleural cavities. Finally, I'd like you to be able to describe breathing and the breathing mechanisms. Respiration is the exchange of gases between the atmosphere and the cells of the body. It's a physiologic process. There are 2 types of respiration, external and internal. External respiration is the exchange of gases between the air in the lungs and the blood. Internal respiration is the exchange of gases between the blood and the individual cells of the body. Breathing is the process that moves air into and out of the lungs. It's a mechanical process. There are two types of breathing in humans: costal or thoracic breathing and diaphragmatic or abdominal breathing. In costal breathing, the major structure causing the movement of the air is the rib cage. In diaphragmatic breathing, interaction between the diaphragm and the abdominal wall causes the air to move into and out of the lungs. The components of the human respiratory system consist of air passageways and two lungs. Air moves from the outside of the body into tiny sacs in the lungs called alveoli. The main subdivisions of the respiratory system may be identified by their relationship to the voice box or larynx. For example, supralaryngeal structures cleanse, warm, moisten, and test the inflowing air. The larynx controls the volume of inflowing air. It produces the selected pitch, in other words, the vibration frequency, in the moving column of air. The infralaryngeal structures distribute air to the alveoli of the lung, where the actual external respiration takes place. Let's consider the supralaryngeal structures for a moment. The external nose is the portion projecting from the face. It's supported primarily by cartilages. It has a midline divider called the nasal septum, which extends from the internal nose. Paired openings, or nostrils, lead to paired spaces called vestibules. Guard hairs in the nostrils filter inflowing air. Behind each vestibule of the external nose is a nasal chamber. The two nasal chambers together form the internal nose. These chambers, too, are separated by the nasal septum. The walls of the nasal chambers are lined with a thick, mucus-type membrane known as the mucoperiosteum. It has a ciliated epithelial surface and a rich blood supply, which provides warmth and moisture. At times, it may become quite swollen. Ciliated means provided with cilia, or hair-like projections which move fluids to the rear. The lateral wall of each chamber has three scroll-like extensions into the nasal chamber which help to increase the surface area exposed to the inflowing air. These scroll-like extensions are known as concha. Concha means seashell. The sense of smell is due to special nerve endings located in the upper areas of the nasal chambers. The epithelium containing the sensory endings is known as the olfactory epithelium. There are air cells or cavities in the skull known as paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are connected with the nasal chambers and are lined with the same ciliated mucoperiosteum. Thus, these sinuses are extensions of the nasal chambers into the skull bones. For this reason, they are known as paranasal sinuses. The pharynx is the common posterior space for the respiratory and digestive systems. That portion of the pharynx specifically related to the respiratory system is the nasopharynx. It is the portion of the pharynx above the soft palate. The two posterior openings, or nares, of the nasal chambers lead into the single space of the nasopharynx. The auditory, or eustachian tubes, also open into the nasopharynx. The auditory tubes connect the nasopharynx with the middle ears to equalize the pressure between the outside and the inside of the eardrum. Lying in the upper posterior wall of the nasopharynx are the pharyngeal tonsils, or adenoids. The soft palate floor of the nasopharynx is a trap door which closes off the upper respiratory passageways during swallowing. The portion of the pharynx closely related to the digestive system is the oropharynx. It's the portion of the pharynx below the soft palate and above the upper edge of the epiglottis. The epiglottis is the flap that prevents food from entering the larynx during swallowing. That portion of the pharynx which is common to the respiratory and digestive system is called the laryngopharynx. It is the portion of the pharynx below the upper edge of the epiglottis. Thus, the digestive and respiratory systems lead into it from above and lead off from it below. The larynx, also called the Adam's apple or voice box, connects the larynx with the trachea. The larynx, located in the anterior neck region, has a box-like shape. Since the voice box of the male becomes larger and heavier during puberty, the voice deepens. The adult male's voice box tends to be located lower in the neck. In the female, the larynx remains higher and smaller, and the voice is of a higher pitch. The larynx has a vestibule, or entrance hallway, which can be covered over by the epiglottis. The glottis itself is the hole between the vocal cords. Through the glottis, air passes from the vestibule into the main chamber of the larynx below the cords, and then into the trachea. The skeleton of the larynx is made up of a series of cartilages. The larynx serves two functions, and there are two sets of muscles, one for each function. One set controls the size of the glottis, thus it regulates the volume of air passing through the trachea. The other set controls the tension of the vocal cords, thus it produces vibrations of selected frequencies or variations in pitch of the moving air to be used in the process of speaking. Now let's turn our attention to the infralaryngeal structures. The respiratory tree is the set of tubular structures which carry the air from the larynx to the alveoli of the lungs. Looking at a person upside down, the trachea is the trunk of the tree and the bronchi are the branches. These tubular parts are held open or made patent by rings of cartilage. Their lining is ciliated to remove mucus and other materials that get into the passageway. The alveoli are tiny spherical or balloon-like sacs which are connected to the larger tubes of the lungs by the tiny tubes known as alveolar ducts and bronchioles. The alveoli are so small that there are billions in the adult lungs. This very small size produces a maximum surface area through which external respiration takes place. External respiration is the actual exchange of gases between the air in the alveolar spaces and the adjacent blood capillaries through their walls. A lung is an individual organ composed of tubular structures and alveoli bound together by fibrous connective tissue. In the human, there are two lungs, the right and the left. Each lung is supplied by a primary or mainstem bronchus leading off of the trachea. The right lung is larger in volume than the left lung. The left lung must have room for the heart. The right lung is divided into 3 pulmonary lobes, upper, middle, and lower, and 10 bronchopulmonary segments, 2 plus 3 plus 5. The left lung is divided into 2 pulmonary lobes, upper and lower, and 8 bronchopulmonary segments, 4 plus 4. A pulmonary lobe is a major subdivision of a lung marked by fissures or deep folds. Each lobe is further partitioned into bronchopulmonary segments. Each lobe is supplied by a secondary or lobar bronchus. Each segment is supplied by a tertiary or segmental bronchus, a branch of the lobar bronchus. Considering pleural cavities, we know that each serous cavity has inner and outer membranes. In the case of the lungs, the inner membrane is known as the visceral pleura, which very closely covers the surface of the lungs. The outer membrane is known as the parietal pleura, forming the outer wall of the cavity. The pleural cavities are the potential spaces between the inner and outer membranes. The pleural cavities allow the lungs to move freely with a minimum of friction during the expansion and contraction of breathing. Let's focus for a few minutes on breathing and breathing mechanisms in humans. Boyle's law tells us that as the volume of a gas-filled container increases, the pressure inside decreases. As the volume of a closed container decreases, the pressure inside increases. When two connected spaces of air have different pressures, the air moves from the space with greater pressure to the one with lesser pressure. In regard to breathing, we can consider the air pressure around the human body to be constant. The pressure inside the lungs may be greater or less than the pressure outside the body. Thus, a greater internal pressure causes air to flow out, a greater external pressure causes air to flow in. We can compare the human trunk to a hollow cylinder. This cylinder is divided into upper and lower cavities by the diaphragm. The upper is the thoracic cavity, which is essentially gas-filled. The lower is the abdominal pelvic cavity and is essentially water-filled. During inhalation, muscles attached to the thoracic cage raise the rib cage. A typical rib might be compared to a bucket handle, attached at one end to the sternum or breastbone and at the other end to the vertebral column. The bucket handle is lifted by the overall movement upward and outward of the rib cage. These movements increase the thoracic diameters from right to left, in other words transversely, and also from front to back, or anterior-posterior. Thus, the intrathoracic volume increases. Remembering Boyle's law, the increase in volume leads to a decrease in pressure. The air pressure outside the body then forces air into the lungs and inflates them. During exhalation, The rib cage movements and pressure relationships are reversed. Thus, intrathoracic volume decreases. The intrathoracic pressure increases and forces air outside the body. We also have diaphragmatic or abdominal breathing. The diaphragm is a thin but strong dome-shaped muscular membrane that separates the abdominal and thoracic cavities. The abdominal wall is elastic in nature. The abdominal cavity is filled with soft, watery tissues. During inhalation, as the diaphragm contracts, the dome flattens and the diaphragm descends. This increases the depth or vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity and thus increases its volume. This decreases air pressure within the thoracic cavity. The greater air pressure outside the body then forces air into the lungs. During exhalation, as the diaphragm relaxes, the elastic abdominal wall forces the diaphragm back up by pushing the watery tissues of the abdomen against the underside of the relaxed diaphragm. The dome extends upward. The process of inhalation is thus reversed. Please take your seat so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 8 of the Basic Human Anatomy course. Today we'll be studying the human urogenital system. I have 7 goals for you in this lesson. First, I'd like you to be able to define urogenital systems. Then identify the function and major parts of the human urinary system. Describe the kidney, including its gross internal structure and the structure of the nephron. Describe the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Identify general characteristics of both the male and female genital systems. Describe the ovaries, the uterine tubes, the uterus, the vagina, the external genitalia, and secondary sexual characteristics of human females. Describe the testes, the epididymis, the ductus deferens, the seminal vesicles, the ejaculatory duct, the prostate gland, the penis, and the secondary sexual characteristics of human males. The human urogenital systems are made up of the urinary organs, which produce the fluid called urine, and the genital or reproductive organs of male and female humans, which together can produce a new human being. Proteins are one of the basic foodstuffs that humans consume. When proteins are used by the body, there are residue or waste products which can be poisonous or toxic if allowed to accumulate in large amounts. The urinary system of the human body is specialized to remove these nitrogenous waste products from the circulating blood. Let's review the major parts of the human urinary system. This system includes 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, one connecting each kidney to the urinary bladder, and the urethra. The kidneys have the same shape and color as kidney beans, but are about 8 to 10 centimeters or 3 to 3.5 inches in length. Each kidney has a fibrous capsule. On the concave medial side of each kidney, there's a notch called the hilus. Through this hilus pass the ureter and the NAVL, nerve, artery, vein, and lymphatic, which service the kidney. Each kidney is attached to the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity just above the waistline level. Each is held in place by special fascia and fat. If we compare the structure of the kidney with that of a cantaloupe or muskmelon, the renal cortex would correspond to the hard rind, the renal medulla would correspond to the edible flesh of the melon, while the renal sinus would correspond to the hollow center after the seeds have been removed. The medulla consists of pyramids with their bases at the cortex and forming peaks or papillae which empty into the sinus. Papilla means pimple or nipple. The nephrons are the functional units of the human kidney. Their primary purpose is to remove the wastes of protein usage from the blood. In addition, they serve to conserve water and other materials for continued use by the body. The end result of nephron function is a more or less concentrated fluid called urine. The kidneys contain a great number of nephrons, about 1 million for each kidney. The main subdivisions of a nephron are the renal corpuscle and a tubular system. The renal corpuscle has hollow double-walled sac called the renal capsule or Bowman's capsule. Leading into the capsule is a very small artery called the afferent arteriole. Within the capsule, this artery becomes a mass of capillaries known as the glomerulus. An efferent arteriole drains the blood away from the capsule. The capsule and the glomerulus together are known as the renal corpuscle. Each renal capsule is drained by a renal tubule. The first part of this tubule runs quite a distance in a coiled formation and is called the proximal convoluted tubule. A long loop, the renal loop of Henle, extends down into the medulla with two straight parts and a sharp bend at the bottom. As the tube returns to the cortex layer, it once again becomes coiled, and here it's known as the distal convoluted tubule. Except for the blood cells and the larger proteins, the fluid portion of the blood passes through the walls of the glomerulus into the cavity between the two layers of the renal capsule. This fluid is called the glomerular filtrate. By a process of taking back or resorption, the majority of the fluid is removed from the tubules, and the concentrated fluid is called urine. The distal convoluted tubules of several nephrons empty into a collecting tubule. The urine is then passed from the collecting tubule at the papillae of the medullary pyramid. Several collecting tubules are present in each pyramid. The renal pelvis is a hollow sac within the sinus of the kidney. Urine from the pyramids collects into the funnel-shaped renal pelvis. The ureter then drains the urine from the renal pelvis. The ureters are tubes which connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder. The smooth muscle walls of the ureters produce a peristalsis or wave-like movement that moves the urine along drop by drop. The urinary bladder is a muscular organ for storing the urine. Near the inferior posterior corners of the urinary bladder are openings where the ureters empty into the bladder. Also, at the inferior aspect of the urinary bladder is the exit, the beginning of the urethra. The triangular area between the openings of the ureters and the urethra is called the trigone, or base, of the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder wall is stretchable to accommodate varying amounts of urine. Nerve endings, called stretch receptors, are found in the wall of the urinary bladder. Usually, the pressure within the urinary bladder is low. However, as the volume of the enclosed urine approaches the bladder's capacity, stretching of the wall stimulates the stretch receptors. The cycle of events controlling urination, voiding, or emptying of the urinary bladder is known as the voiding reflex. The urethra is a tube which connects the urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. It begins at the anterior base of the urinary bladder. The urethral sphincters are circular muscle masses which control the passage of the urine through the urethra. There are two urethral sphincters, an internal urethral sphincter and an external urethral sphincter. The internal urethral sphincter is located on the floor of the urinary bladder. It's made of smooth muscle tissue. It's controlled by the nerves of the autonomic nervous system. The external urethral sphincter is more inferior around the urethra in the area of the pelvic floor. It is made up of striated muscle tissue, and it's controlled by the peripheral nervous system. There are some male-female differences. The female urethra is short and direct. The male urethra is much longer and has two curvatures. Whereas the female urethra serves only a urinary function, the male urethra serves both the urinary and reproductive functions. Now I'd like to consider the human genital or reproductive systems. The human male and human female each has a system of organs specifically designed for the production of new humans. These systems are known as reproductive or genital systems. Since there are different systems for males and females, the genital systems are an example of sexual dimorphism. Morph means form or shape, and di means two. So sexual dimorphism means having two different forms according to sex. The existence of two parents for each child means that genetic materials are recombined to produce a new type. This new type may be an improvement over previous generations. Components of the genital system may be considered in the following categories. First, primary sex organs, or gonads. The primary sex organs produce sex cells, also known as gametes. A male gamete and a female gamete may be united to form the one-cell beginning of an embryo, the process of fertilization. Primary sex organs also produce sex hormones. Secondary sex organs care for the product of the primary sex organ. Secondary sexual characteristics are those traits that tend to make males and females more attractive to each other. Secondary sexual characteristics help to ensure mating. These characteristics first appear around the time of puberty at around 10 to 15 years of age. The primary sex organ in the human female is the ovary. The ovaries are located to the sides of the upper end of the uterus. They are anchored to the posterior surface of the broad ligaments. The broad ligaments are sheets or folds of peritoneum enclosing the uterus in uterine tubes and extending to the sides of the pelvis. The ovary produces the egg cell or ovum. The ovary produces female sex hormones called estrogens and progesterone. And the production of ova is cyclic. One ovum is released in each menstrual period about every 28 days. Extending to either side of the uterus are two muscular tubes which open at the outer ends like fringed trumpets. The fringe-like appendages encircle the ovaries. At their medial ends, the uterine tubes open into the uterus. The function of the uterine tubes is to pick up the ovum when released from the ovary and hold it until one of the following happens. 1. It's fertilized. After fertilization, the initial stages of embryo development take place. The developing embryo is eventually moved into the uterus. Or 2. The nutrient stored within the ovum is used up and the ovum dies. This may take 3 to 5 days. The uterus is a site where all but the first few days of embryo development take place. After 8 weeks of embryonic development, it is known as the fetus. The uterus is shaped like a pear with the stem, or cervix, facing downward and toward the rear. The fundus is the portion of the uterus above the openings of the uterine tubes. The main part, or body, is the portion between the cervix and the fundus. The uterus usually leans forward with the body slightly curved as it passes over the top of the urinary bladder. The cervix opens into the upper end of the vagina. The inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. Made up of epithelium, it's well supplied with blood vessels and glands. The muscular wall of the uterus is called the myometrium. In the body of the uterus, the muscular tissue is in a double spiral arrangement. In the cervix, it's in a circular arrangement. The uterus of an infant female is undeveloped. During puberty, the uterus develops. The uterus of an adult is fully developed. The uterus of an older woman is reduced in size and non-functional. The vagina is a tubular structure connecting the cervix of the uterus with the outside. It serves as a birth canal and as an organ of copulation. It's capable of stretching during childbirth. The lower opening of the vagina may be partially closed by a thin membrane known as the hymen. Other terms for the external genitals of the human female are vulva and pudendum. The mons pubis is a mound of fat tissue covered with skin and hair in front of the symphysis pubis, or the joint of the pubic bones. The labia majora extends back from the mons pubis and encircles the vestibule. There are two folds known as the labia majora. Their construction is similar to the mons pubis, including fatty tissue and skin. The outer surfaces are covered with hair. The inner surfaces are moist and smooth. The corresponding structure in the male is the scrotum. Labia means lips. The labia minora are two folds of skin lying within the labia majora and also enclosing the vestibule. In front, each labium minus divides into two folds. The fold above the clitoris is called the prepuce of the clitoris. The fold below is called the frenulum. The clitoris is a small projection of sensitive erectile tissue which corresponds to the male penis. However, the female urethra does not pass through the clitoris. The cleft between the labia minora and behind the clitoris is called the vestibule. It includes the urethral opening in front and the vaginal opening slightly to the rear. When an embryo forms an attachment to the endometrium, a pregnancy exists. The attachment eventually forms a placenta, an organ joining mother and offspring for such purposes as nutrition of the offspring. The fetal membranes surrounding the developing individual or fetus are filled with amniotic fluid. During the first 8 weeks, the developing organism is known as an embryo. During this time, the major systems and parts of the body develop. During the remainder of the pregnancy, the developing organism is known as the fetus. During this time, growth and refinement of the body parts occur. Parturition is the actual delivery of the fetus into a free living state. The delivery of the fetus is followed by a second delivery, that of the placenta and the fetal membranes. About 2 weeks after an ovum is released, if it is not fertilized, menstruation occurs. Menstruation involves the loss of all but the basal layer of an endometrium. The process includes bleeding. It first occurs at puberty and lasts until menopause, around 45 to 55 years of age. After menopause, pregnancy is no longer possible. The secondary sexual characteristics of females include growth of pubic hair, development of mammary glands, development of the pelvic girdle, and deposition of fat in the mons pubis and labia majora. We previously talked about the mammary glands in Lesson 3. Secretion of milk begins after parturition. Stimulation from suckling helps to maintain the normal rate of milk secretion. At the time of menopause, breast tissue becomes less prominent. The primary sex organ of the human male is the testis. The testes are egg-shaped. The paired testes lie within the scrotum. The scrotum is a sac of loose skin attached to the pubic area of the lower abdomen. The scrotum provides a site cooler than body temperature to maintain the viability of the spermatozoa. However, when the air is too cold, muscles and muscular fibers draw the testes and scrotum closer to the body to maintain warmth. Otherwise, the scrotum hangs loosely. The tunica vaginalis is a serous cavity surrounding each testis. The testis produces the male sex cells called spermatozoa. The spermatozoa are continuously produced by the millions. One such cell may eventually fertilize an ovum of a human female. The testes also produce male sex hormones called androgens. Let's consider the male secondary sex organs. The epididymis is a coiled tube whose function is to aid in the maturation of spermatozoa. Its coil length is only about 1.5 inches, but its uncoiled length is about 16 feet. When coiled, it extends downward along the posterior side of each testis. Its lining secretes a nutritive medium for spermatozoa. It receives spermatozoa from the testes in an immature state. As the spermatozoa pass through the nutrient, they mature. The ductus deferens is a transporting tube which carries the mature sperm from the epididymis to the prostate. Each tube enters the abdomen through the inguinal canal. Each passes over a ureter to reach the back of the urinary bladder and then down to the prostate gland. Lying alongside each ductus deferens as it crosses the back of the bladder is a tubular structure called the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle produces a fluid which becomes part of the ejaculate. Each ductus deferens and its corresponding seminal vesicle converge to form a short tube called the ejaculatory duct. The ejaculatory duct opens into the urethra within the prostate gland. The ejaculatory duct carries both spermatozoa and seminal vesicle fluid. As the urethra leaves the urinary bladder, its first inch is surrounded by a chestnut-sized gland called the prostate gland. The prostate gland provides an additional fluid to be added to the spermatozoa and seminal vesicle fluid. As the urethra leaves the abdomen, it passes through the penis, the male organ of copulation. Surrounding the urethra is a central cylinder of erectile tissue called the corpus spongiosum. This cylinder is bulb-shaped at each end. The posterior end is attached to the base of the pelvis. The sensitive anterior end is known as the glans. Corpus spongiosum means spongy body. Overlying the corpus spongiosum is a pair of cylinders of erectile tissue called the corpora cavernosa. These two cylinders are separate in their proximal fourth and joined in their distal three-quarters. They're attached to the pubic bones. Together, the corpus spongiosum and the corpora cavernosa combine to form the shaft of the penis. Corpora cavernosum equals cavernous body. The prepuce, or foreskin, is a covering of skin for the glands. It may be removed in a surgical procedure called circumcision. The secondary sexual characteristics of males include growth of facial, pubic, and chest hair, growth of the larynx to deepen the voice, the deposition of protein to increase the muscularity and general body size. Please take your seat so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 9 of the Basic Human Anatomy course. Today we'll be studying the human cardiovascular and lymphatic systems. I have 10 goals for you in this lesson. First, I want you to name and briefly explain the 4 basic components of any circulatory system. Second, I'd like you to define the human cardiovascular system, name its 4 major components, and match its components with the 4 basic components of any circulatory system. Briefly describe plasma in the formed elements of the blood and state 4 general functions of blood. Describe the general construction of a blood vessel. Name 3 types of blood vessels. State the basic function of each type. Describe the general construction of the human heart, including its auricles, atria, ventricles, septa, wall layers, variations of wall thickness, and the names, structures, and position of the cardiac valves. Describe 3 different control systems regulating the heartbeat. Describe the coronary arteries and the cardiac veins and their function. Briefly describe the pericardium. Describe cardiovascular circulatory patterns, including the terms collateral circulation, end artery, pulmonary cycle, and systemic cycle. Name the major arteries and veins of the human body and the areas serviced or supplied. Briefly describe lymphatic capillaries, lymph vessels including the thoracic duct, lymph nodes, and tonsils. The need for circulatory systems is based on 2 criteria. First, the number of cells. Multicellular animals are animals with a great number of cells. And 2, size. In larger animals, most cells are too far away from sources of food and oxygen for simple diffusion to provide sufficient amounts. Also, distances are too great for simple removal of wastes. Because of these criteria, we need a system or systems to carry materials to all cells. To get food and oxygen to the cells and to remove waste products, we need a transport system or circulatory system. Human circulatory systems are so effective that no cell is more than 2 cells away from a blood capillary. The 4 basic components of any circulatory system are a vehicle, conduits, a motive force, and exchange areas. The vehicle is the substance which actually carries the materials being transported. A conduit is a channel, pipe, or tube through which a vehicle travels. If we say that a force is motive, we mean that it produces movement. Systems providing a motive force are often known as pumps. Finally, we need exchange areas. Since the materials being transported must eventually be exchanged with a part of the body, special areas are developed for this purpose. They're called exchange areas. In the human body, the cardiovascular system is the circulatory system involving the heart and blood vessels. The lymphatic system is a drainage-type circulatory system involved with the clear fluid known as lymph. There are other minor circulatory systems in the human body, such as the one involved with cerebrospinal fluid. The human cardiovascular system is a collection of interacting structures designed to supply oxygen and nutrients to living cells and to remove carbon dioxide and other wastes. Its major components are the blood, blood vessels, heart, and capillaries. Blood is the vehicle for oxygen, nutrients, and wastes. Blood vessels are the conduits or channels through which the blood is pumped. The heart is the pump which provides primary motive force. And the capillaries are minute, very small vessels. They provide exchange areas. For example, in the capillaries of the lungs, oxygen is added and carbon dioxide is removed from the blood. Blood is the vehicle for the human cardiovascular system. Its major subdivisions are the plasma, a fluid containing proteins, and the formed elements, including red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Plasma makes up about 55% of the total blood volume. It's mainly composed of water. A variety of materials are dissolved within plasma. Among the most important of these are proteins. After the blood clots, the clear fluid remaining is called serum. Serum does not contain the proteins used for clotting. Otherwise, it's very similar to plasma. The formed elements make up about 45% of the total blood volume. The formed elements are cellular in nature. While the red blood cells and white blood cells are cells, the platelets are only fragments of cells. Red blood cells are known as erythrocytes. These are biconcave discs. That is, they are shaped something like an inner tube from an automobile tire, but with a thin middle portion instead of a hole. There are approximately 5 million red blood cells in a cubic millimeter of normal adult blood. Red blood cells contain hemoglobin, a protein which carries most of the oxygen transported by the blood. White blood cells are called leukocytes. There are various types of white blood cells, but the most common are neutrophils and lymphocytes. Neutrophils phagocytize, or swallow up, foreign particles in organisms and digest them. Lymphocytes produce antibodies and serve other functions in immunity. In normal adults, there are about 5,000 to 11,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. Platelets are about half the size of red blood cells. They are fragments of cells. Since they are fragile, they last only about 3 to 5 days. Their main function is to aid in clotting by clumping together and by releasing chemical factors related to clotting. There are 150,000 to 350,000 platelets in a cubic millimeter of normal blood. Here are some general functions of the blood. Blood serves as a vehicle for oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide, and other wastes, hormones, antibodies, heat, and other products. Blood also aids in temperature control. Beneath the skin there is a network of vessels that functions much like a radiator. To avoid accumulation of excess heat in the body, the flow of blood to these vessels can be increased greatly. Here, aided by the evaporative cooling provided by the sweat glands, large amounts of heat can be rapidly given off. The flow of blood also helps keep the outer parts of the body from becoming too cold. The blood aids in protecting our bodies by providing immunity. Some white blood cells phagocytize or swallow up foreign particles and microorganisms. Other white blood cells produce antibodies. The blood transports antibodies throughout the body. Finally, blood clotting is another function of blood. Not only does this prevent continued blood loss, but it also helps prevent invasion of the body by microorganisms and viruses by sealing the wound opening. A few words about blood vessels. The blood is conducted or carried through the body by tubular structures known as blood vessels. Since at no time does the whole blood ever leave a blood vessel of some sort, we refer to this system as a closed system. The blood vessels in general are tubular and have a three-layered wall. The lumen, or hollow central cavity, is lined by a layer of smooth epithelium known as the intima. The middle layer of smooth muscle tissue is called the media. The adventitia is the outer layer of fibrous connective tissue that holds everything together. We recognize three types of blood vessels. The arteries carry blood away from the chambers of the heart. The veins carry blood to the chambers of the heart. And capillaries are extremely thin-walled vessels having only the intimal layer through which exchanges can take place between the blood and the tissue cells. Arteries and veins are largest where they are closest to the heart. Away from the heart, they branch into smaller and more numerous vessels. The branching continues until the smallest arteries, or arterioles, empty into the capillaries. The capillaries, in turn, are drained by the venules of the venous system. Within the heart and the veins are structures known as valves. Valves function to ensure that the blood flows in only one direction. Let's discuss the heart. Through the action of its very muscular walls, the heart produces the primary motive force to drive the blood through the arterial system. In humans, the heart is located just above the diaphragm, in the middle of the thorax and extending slightly to the left. It's said that the heart of an average individual is about the size of that individual's clenched fist. The heart is divided into four cavities known as the chambers. The upper two chambers are known as the atria, right and left. Each atrium has an ear-like projection known as an auricle. The lower two chambers are known as ventricles, right and left. Between the two atria is a common wall known as the interatrial septum. Between the two ventricles is a common wall known as the interventricular septum. Atrium means hall, auricle means ear-like flap, venter means belly, and septum means fence. The walls of the chambers are in three general layers. Lining the cavity of each chamber is a smooth epithelium known as the endocardium. Inflammation of the endocardium is called endocarditis. The middle layer is made up of cardiac muscle tissue and is known as myocardium. The outer layer of the heart is another epithelium known as the epicardium. If you were to look at a cross-section of the chambers, it would show that the atrial walls are relatively thin. The right ventricular wall is much thicker. The left ventricular wall is 3 to 5 times thicker than that of the right. These differences in wall thickness reflect the amount of muscle tissue needed to produce the amount of pressure required in each chamber. Between the atrium and the ventricle of each side is the atrioventricular valve known as the AV valve. Each AV valve prevents the blood from going back into the atrium from the ventricle of the same side. The right AV valve is known as the tricuspid valve. The left AV valve is known as the mitral valve. The leaflets or flaps of the AV valves are prevented from being pushed back into the atria by fibrous cords. These fibrous cords are attached to the underside, the ventricular side, of the leaflets and are called the chordae tendineae. At their inner ends, the chordae tendineae are attached to the inner walls of the ventricles by papillary muscles. A major artery leads away from each ventricle, the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle and the aortic arch from the left ventricle. A semilunar valve is found at the base of each of the pulmonary trunk and the aortic arch. These semilunar valves prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricles. The pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve are each made up of 3 semilunar pocket-like cusps. The heart is under several different control systems: the extrinsic nervous control, the intrinsic nervous control, and the humeral control. Extrinsic nervous control is control from outside of the heart. Extrinsic control is exerted by nerves of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic cardiac nerves accelerate or speed up the heart. The vagus parasympathetic nerve decelerates or slows down the heart. Intrinsic nervous control is control built within the heart. The intrinsic nervous system consists of the sinoatrial or SA node, often referred to as the pacemaker, the atrioventricular or AV node, and the septal bundles. The septal bundles spread through the walls of the ventricles just beneath the endocardium. This combination of nodes and bundles initiates the heartbeat automatically and transmits the impulse through the atria and the ventricles. In addition to the nervous control of the heart action, it appears that there are substances in the blood itself which have varying effects on the functioning of the heart. This is called humeral control. Although these substances are not as yet well understood, they appear to have some importance. The transplanted heart seems to depend to a degree on this control mechanism, since much of its nervous controls have been lost for the initial period in the recipient's body. We may say that the heart deals with 2 different kinds of blood flow: functional blood flow and nutritive blood flow. Functional blood flow is the blood that the heart works on or pushes with its motive force. However, the walls of the heart require nutrition that they cannot get directly from the blood within the chambers. Nutritive blood flow is supplied to these walls by the coronary arteries right and left. The coronary arteries arise from the base of the aortic arch and are distributed over the surface of the heart. This blood is collected by the cardiac veins and empties into the right atrium of the heart. Should a coronary artery or one of its branches become closed for whatever reason, that part of the heart wall formerly supplied nutrient blood by the closed vessel will very likely die. The average heart contracts in what is known as a heartbeat about 70 to 80 times a minute. To reduce the frictional forces that would be applied to its moving surfaces, the heart is enclosed in a special serous sac known as the pericardium, in other words, around the heart. The human cardiovascular system is described as a closed, 2-cycle system. It is closed because at no place is the blood as whole blood ever outside the system. It has 2 cycles because the blood passes through the heart twice with each complete circuit of the body. In the pulmonary cycle, the blood passes from the right heart through the lungs into the left heart. In the systemic cycle, the blood passes from the left heart through the body in general and then returns to the right heart. It's common for an area of the body to be supplied by more than one blood vessel, so that if one is damaged, the others will continue the supply. This is known as collateral circulation. However, there are situations, such as in the heart and the brain, where a single artery supplies a specific part of a structure. Such an artery is called an end artery. When an end artery is damaged, that area supplied by it will usually die, as in the case of a coronary artery or in the case of a stroke in the brain. The pulmonary cycle begins in the right ventricle of the heart. Contraction of the right ventricular wall applies pressure to the blood. This forces the tricuspid valve closed, and the closed valve prevents blood from going back into the right atrium. The pressure forces blood past the semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. Upon relaxation of the right ventricle, back pressure of the blood in the pulmonary trunk closes the pulmonary semilunar valve. The blood then passes into the lungs through the pulmonary arterial system. Gases are exchanged between the alveoli of the lungs and the blood in the capillaries next to the alveoli. This blood, now saturated with oxygen, is collected by the pulmonary veins and carried to the left atrium of the heart. This completes the pulmonary cycle. The systemic cycle starts in the left atrium. The oxygen-saturated blood is moved from the left atrium into the left ventricle. When the left ventricular wall contracts, the pressure closes the mitral valve, which prevents blood from returning back to the left atrium. The contraction of the left ventricular wall therefore forces blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aortic arch. Upon relaxation of the left ventricular wall, the back pressure of the aortic arch forces the aortic semilunar valve closed. The blood then passes through the various arteries to the tissues of the body. The carotid arteries supply the head. The neck and upper members are supplied by the subclavian arteries. The aortic arch continues as a large single vessel known as the aorta, passing down through the trunk of the body in front of the vertebral column. It gives off branches to the trunk wall and to the contents of the trunk. At the lower end of the trunk, the aorta divides into right and left iliac arteries, supplying the pelvic region and lower members. In the capillary beds of the tissues of the body, materials such as food, oxygen, and waste products are exchanged between the blood and the cells of the body. The blood from the capillaries among the tissues is collected by a venous system parallel to the arteries. This system of deep veins returns the blood back to the right atrium of the heart. In the subcutaneous layer, immediately beneath the skin, is a network of superficial veins draining the skin areas. These superficial veins collect and then join the deep veins in the axilla, the armpits, and the inguinal region, the groin. The superior vena cava collects the blood from the head, neck, and upper members. The inferior vena cava collects the blood from the rest of the body. As the major veins, the vena cava empty the returned blood into the right atrium of the heart. The veins are generally supplied with valves to assist in making the blood flow towards the heart. It's of some interest to note that the veins from the head don't contain valves. From that portion of the gut where materials are absorbed through the walls into the capillaries, the blood receives a great variety of substances. While most of these substances are useful, some may be harmful to the body. The blood carrying these substances is carried directly to the liver by the hepatic portal venous system. This blood is specially treated and conditioned in the liver before it's returned to the general circulation by way of the hepatic veins. Let's talk about the human lymphatic system for a moment. Between the cells of the body are spaces filled with fluid. This is the interstitial or tissue fluid, often referred to as intercellular fluid. There are continuous exchanges between the intercellular fluid, the interstitial fluid, and the plasma of the blood. The lymphatic system returns to the bloodstream the excess interstitial fluid, which includes protein and fluid derived from the blood. Lymphatic capillaries are located in the interstitial spaces. Here they absorb the excess fluids. A tributary system of vessels collects these excess fluids, now called lymph. Like veins, lymphatic vessels are supplied with valves to help maintain a flow of lymph in one direction only. The lymphatic vessels, to a greater or lesser extent, parallel the venous vessels along the way. The major lymph vessel in the human body is called the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct passes from the abdomen up through the thorax and into the root of the neck in front of the vertebral column. The thoracic duct there empties into the junction of the left subclavian and jugular veins. Along the way, lymphatic vessels are interrupted by special structures known as lymph nodes. These lymph nodes serve as special filters for the lymph fluid passing through. Tonsils are special collections of lymphoid tissue very similar to a group of lymph nodes. These are protective structures and are located primarily at the entrances of the respiratory and digestive systems. Please take your seat so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 10 of the Basic Human Anatomy course. Today we'll be studying the human endocrine system. I have a number of goals for you in this lesson. I'd like you to be able to define endocrine glands, hormones, target organs, and feedback mechanisms. Next, I'd like you to be able to briefly describe 3 different control systems of the human body. Be able to briefly describe the endocrine system and name 6 better-known endocrine organs. Next, describe the pituitary body, including its location, its major subdivisions, and the origins and hormones of each subdivision. Finally, I'd like you to be able to describe the location, structure, and hormones for each of the following: the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the pancreatic islets, the suprarenal glands. Name the primary sex organs and the sex hormones for each gender. Endo means internal. Crin means secrete. The endocrine glands are glands of internal secretion rather than external as seen with the sweat glands or digestive glands. This internal secretion results from the fact that these glands have no ducts, thus they are often referred to as the ductless glands. The secretions produced by the endocrine glands are called hormones. Hormones are carried by the bloodstream to specific organs or tissues, which are then called target organs. The activity of the target organ, in turn, affects the activity of the endocrine organ. Thus, it is a reverse or feedback mechanism. The structure and function of the human body is controlled and organized by several different systems. The first is heredity and environment. The interaction of heredity and environment is the fundamental control system. Genes determine the range of potentiality and environment develops it. For example, good nutrition will allow a person to attain his full body height and weight within the limits of his genetic determination. Genetics is the study of heredity. The second system is hormones. The hormones of the endocrine system serve to control the tissues and organs in general. Vitamins have a similar role. Both hormones and vitamins are chemical substances required only in small quantities. The third is the nervous system. More precise and immediate control of the structures of the body is carried out by the nervous system. In the human body, the endocrine system consists of a number of ductless glands producing their specific hormones. Because these hormones are carried to their target organs by the bloodstream, the endocrine organs or glands are richly supplied with blood vessels. The better-known endocrine organs are the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans, the suprarenal or adrenal glands, and the gonads, in other words, in the female the ovaries and in the male the testes. In addition, there are several other endocrine organs less well understood and other organs suspected to be of the endocrine type. The pituitary body is a small pea-sized and pea-shaped structure. It's attached to the base of the brain in the region of the hypothalamus. In addition, it is housed within a hollow of the bony floor of the cranial cavity. This hollow is called the sella turcica. It's also called the Turk's saddle. The pituitary body is actually 2 glands, the posterior pituitary gland and the anterior pituitary gland. Initially separate, these glands join together during the development of the embryo. The posterior pituitary gland is the portion which comes from and retains a direct connection with the base of the brain. The hormones of the posterior pituitary gland are actually produced in the hypothalamus of the brain. From the hypothalamus, the hormones are delivered to the posterior pituitary gland, where they are released into the bloodstream. At present, we recognize 2 hormones of the posterior pituitary gland. The first is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. ADH is involved with the resorption or salvaging of water within the kidneys. ADH is produced under thirst conditions. The other is oxytocin. Oxytocin is concerned with the contractions of smooth muscle in the uterus and with milk secretion. The anterior pituitary gland originates from the roof of the embryo's mouth. Then it attaches itself to the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is indirectly connected to the hypothalamus by means of a venous portal system. By portal, we mean that the veins carry substances from the capillaries at one point to the capillaries at another point, the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. In the hypothalamus, certain chemicals known as releasing factors are produced. These are carried by the portal system to the anterior pituitary gland. Here, they stimulate the cells of the anterior pituitary gland to secrete their specific hormones. In general, they stimulate the target organs to develop or produce their own products. This stimulating effect is referred to as a trophic. Of the many hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland, we will examine 6 of them. First is somatotrophic hormone, or growth hormone. The target organs of this hormone are the growing structures of the body. This hormone influences such structures to grow. ACTH is adrenocorticotrophic hormone. This hormone of the anterior pituitary gland stimulates the cortex of the suprarenal or adrenal gland to produce its hormones. We'll later see that the hormones of the suprarenal cortex are involved with anti-inflammatory reactions of the body. Thyrotropin is also known as TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone. This hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce its hormones. Luteinizing hormone is abbreviated LH. LH stimulates ovulation and luteinization of ovarian follicles in females and promotes testosterone production in males. FSH is the abbreviation for follicle-stimulating hormone. FSH stimulates ovarian follicular growth in females and stimulates spermatogenesis in males. Prolactin stimulates milk production and maternal behavior in females. The thyroid gland is in the neck region just below the larynx and surrounds the trachea. The right and left thyroid lobes are the masses on either side of the trachea. The isthmus is found across the front of the trachea and connects the 2 lobes. Each lobe of the thyroid gland is supplied by arteries from above and below, the superior and inferior thyroid arteries. The primary hormone of the thyroid gland is thyroxin. Thyroxin affects the basal metabolic rate, BMR, the level of activity of the body. Since iodine is a necessary element in the production of thyroxin, one can observe malformations of the thyroid gland, called goiters, where there is little or no iodine available. A second hormone, called calcitonin, is produced by the thyroid gland and is involved with calcium metabolism in the body. Located on the posterior aspects of the thyroid lobes are 2 pairs of small round masses of tissue known as the parathyroid glands. The hormone produced by the parathyroid glands is called parathyroid hormone or parathormone. It's involved with calcium metabolism. Let's talk about the pancreatic islets, or islands of Langerhans. Within the substance of the pancreas are distributed small groups of cells known as islets. Although the pancreas is a ducted gland of the digestive system, these isolated islets are in fact ductless glands. Insulin and glucagon are the 2 most commonly recognized hormones of the islets. These hormones are involved with glucose metabolism. Embedded in the fat above each kidney is a suprarenal gland. Both suprarenal glands have an internal medulla and an external cortex. The medullary portion of each suprarenal gland produces a pair of hormones, epinephrine, or adrenaline, and norepinephrine, or noradrenaline. These hormones are involved in the mobilization of energy during the stress reaction of fight or flight. Each suprarenal cortex produces a variety of hormones which can be grouped into 3 categories: mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and sex hormones. Mineralocorticoids, for example aldosterone, are concerned with electrolytes of the body. Glucocorticoids, for example cortisol, are concerned with many metabolic functions and are anti-inflammatory in nature. Sex hormones include the adrenal androgens and estrogens. In humans, the primary sex organs are known as gonads. The gonads produce sex cells, or gametes, and sex hormones. These sex hormones are in addition to those produced by the suprarenal cortex. In the female, the ovaries produce 2 types of sex hormones during the menstrual cycle. During the first half of the cycle, the estrogens are produced. During the last half of the cycle, progesterone is produced. These hormones are concerned with female sexuality and with the preparation of female sex organs for reproduction. In the male, certain cells of the testes produce the male sex hormones known as androgens, for example testosterone. Androgens are concerned with male sexuality. Please take your seat so we can get started. Welcome to Lesson 11 of the Basic Human Anatomy course. Today we'll be studying the human nervous system. I have a number of goals for you in this lesson. Name and identify two types of nervous tissues. Name three functions for which nervous tissues are specialized. Define neuron, dendrite, and axon. When given the shape, diameter, or function, name the corresponding type of neuron. Describe neuron connections, including the synapse and the neuromuscular junction. Name and identify the three major divisions of the human nervous system. Name the two major subdivisions of the central nervous system. Name and briefly describe the three major subdivisions of the human brain. Name and locate the four ventricles and their connecting channels. Describe the spinal cord, including the two enlargements, elements of its cross-section, and the surrounding vertebral canal. Describe the meninges and the skeletal coverings of the central nervous system. Name and identify the main arteries and veins of the brain and briefly describe the blood supply of the spinal cord. Describe the formation of cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, and the path of CSF flow. Define peripheral nervous system and nerve. Name and briefly describe two categories of peripheral nervous system nerves. Describe the anatomy of a typical spinal nerve. Define reflex and reflex arc. Briefly describe the components of the general reflex arc. Define autonomic nervous system and visceral organs. Briefly describe efferent pathways of the autonomic nervous system. Name the major divisions of the human autonomic nervous system. Briefly describe the major activities of the human autonomic nervous system for the thoracolumbar and craniosacral outflows. Briefly describe the first and second neurons, innervations, and effects in each case. Define pathway, neuraxis, sensory pathway, and motor pathway. Briefly describe levels of control, pyramidal and extrapyramidal motor pathways and sensory pathways, and give examples of general senses and special senses. Briefly describe the sensory receptors and sensory pathways for the special senses of smell and taste. Describe the structures of the bulbous oculi, the orbit, and the adnexa. Describe the structures of the external ear, the middle ear, and the internal ear. Describe the structures of the sacculus, utriculus, semicircular ducts, and the vestibular nerve. Describe controls in the human nervous system. There are two types of nervous tissues, the neurons or nerve cells, and glia or neuroglia. The neuron is the basic structural unit of the nervous system. The glia are cells of supporting tissue for the nervous system. There are several different types of glia, but their general function is support. Nervous tissues are specialized to receive stimuli, transmit information, and to store information. Cells receiving stimuli are said to be irritable, as are all living cells to a degree. The storing of information is called memory. A neuron is a nerve cell body and all of its processes or branches. The neuron cell body is similar to that of the typical animal cell that we described in Lesson 1. There are two types of neuron processes, dendrites and axons. A dendrite is a neuron process which carries impulses towards the cell body. Each neuron may have one or more dendrites. Dendrites receive information and transmit it or carry it to the cell body. An axon is a neuron process which transmits information from the cell body to the next unit. Each neuron has only one axon. Information is carried as electrical impulses along the length of the neuron. Some neuron processes have a covering, which is a series of Schwann cells, interrupted by nodes or thin spots. This gives the neuron process the appearance of links of sausage. The Schwann cells produce a lipid, fatty material called myelin. This myelin acts as an electrical insulator during the transmission of impulses. Neurons may be identified according to shape, diameter of their processes, or function. In terms of shape, a pole is the point where a neuron process meets the cell body. To determine the type according to shape, count the number of poles. Multipolar neurons have more than two poles, one axon and two or more dendrites. Bipolar neurons have two poles, one axon and one dendrite. Unipolar neurons have a single process which branches into a T-shape, One arm is an axon, the other is a dendrite. Neurons may be rated according to the thickness of the myelin surrounding the axon. In order of decreasing thickness, they are rated A, the thickest, B, and C, the thinnest. The thickness affects the rate at which impulses are transmitted. The thickest are the fastest. The thinnest are the slowest. Neurons may also be classified according to their function. In sensory neurons, impulses are transmitted from receptor organs for pain, vision, hearing, and other senses to the central nervous system. In motor neurons, impulses are transmitted from the central nervous system to muscles and glands or effector organs. Interneurons transmit information from one neuron to another. An interneuron connects two other neurons. There are other, more specialized types, for example, in the central nervous system. A neuron may connect either with another neuron or with a muscle fiber. A phrase we sometimes use to describe these connections is continuity without contact. Neurons do not actually touch. There is just enough space to prevent the electrical transmission from crossing from the first neuron to the next. This space is called the synaptic cleft. Information is transferred across the synaptic cleft by chemicals called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are manufactured and stored on only one side of the cleft. Because of this, information flows in only one direction across the cleft. A synapse is a connection between two neurons. An axon terminates in tiny branches. At the end of each branch is found a terminal bulb. Synaptic vesicles, or bundles of neurotransmitter, are located within each terminal bulb. That portion of the terminal bulb which faces the synaptic cleft is thickened and is called the presynaptic membrane. This is the membrane through which neurotransmitters pass to enter the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft is the space between the terminal bulb of the first neuron and the dendrite or cell body of the second neuron. On the second neuron, the terminal bulb of the first neuron lies near a site on a dendrite or the cell body. The membrane at this site on the second neuron is known as the postsynaptic membrane. Within the second neuron is a chemical that inactivates the used neurotransmitter. A neuromuscular junction is a connection between the terminal of a motor neuron and a muscle fiber. The neuromuscular junction has an organization identical to a synapse. However, the bulb is larger. The postsynaptic membrane is also larger and has foldings to increase its surface area. The axon of a motor neuron ends as it reaches a striated muscle fiber of a skeletal muscle. At this point, it has a terminal bulb. Within this bulb are synaptic vesicles, bundles of neurotransmitter. The presynaptic membrane lines the surface of the terminal bulb and lies close to the muscle fiber. The synaptic cleft is a space between the terminal bulb of the motor neuron and the membrane of the muscle fiber. The terminal bulb of the motor neuron protrudes into the surface of the muscle fiber. The membrane lining the synaptic space has foldings and is called the postsynaptic membrane. Beneath the postsynaptic membrane is a chemical which inactivates the used neurotransmitter. The major divisions of the human nervous system are the central nervous system, or CNS, the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, and the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. The CNS is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Both the peripheral nervous system and autonomic nervous system carry information to and from the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is generally concerned with the innervation of skeletal muscles and other muscles made up of striated muscle tissue, as well as sensory information from the periphery of the body. The autonomic nervous system is that portion of the nervous system concerned with control of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The central nervous system is known as central because its anatomic location is along the central axis of the body and because the central nervous system is central in function. If we use a computer analogy to understand that it is central in function, the CNS would be the central processing unit, and other parts of the nervous system would be the supply inputs and transmit outputs. The major subdivisions of the central nervous system are the brain and the spinal cord. The coverings of the central nervous system are skeletal and fibrous. The cerebrospinal fluid is a liquid thought to serve as a cushion and circulatory vehicle within the central nervous system. The human brain has three major subdivisions: the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. The central nervous system is first formed as a simple tube-like structure in the embryo. The concentration of nervous tissues at one end of the human embryo to produce the brain and head is referred to as cephalization. When the embryo is about 4 weeks old, it is possible to identify the early forms of the brainstem, cerebellum, and cerebrum, as well as the spinal cord. As development continues, the brain is located within the cranium in the cranial cavity. The term brainstem refers to that part of the brain that would remain after removal of the cerebrum and cerebellum. The brainstem is the basal portion, the portion of the base, of the brain. The brainstem can be divided into forebrainstem, midbrainstem, and hindbrainstem, incorporating the thalamus and hypothalamus in the forebrainstem, the corpora quadrigemina and the cerebral peduncles in the midbrainstem, and the pons and medulla in the hindbrainstem. The brainstem is continuous with the spinal cord. Together, the brainstem and the spinal cord are sometimes known as the neuraxis. The brainstem provides motor relays and controls for information passing up or down the neuraxis. The 12 pairs of cranial nerves connect at the sides of the brainstem. The cerebellum is a spherical mass of nervous tissue attached to and covering the hind brainstem. It has a narrow part called the vermis and right and left cerebellar hemispheres. A peduncle is a stem-like connecting part. The cerebellum is connected to the brainstem with 3 pairs of peduncles. A cross-section of the cerebellum reveals that the outer cortex is composed of gray matter, cell bodies of neurons with many folds and sulci. More centrally located is the white matter, or myelinated processes of neurons. The cerebellum is the primary coordinator or integrator of motor actions in the body. The cerebrum consists of 2 very much enlarged hemispheres connected to each other by a special structure called the corpus callosum. Each cerebral hemisphere is connected to the brainstem by a cerebral peduncle. The surface of each cerebral hemisphere is subdivided into areas known as lobes. Each lobe is named according to the cranial bone under which it lies: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. The space separating the 2 cerebral hemispheres is called the longitudinal fissure. The shallow grooves in the surface of the cerebrum are called sulci. The ridges outlined by the sulci are known as gyri. The cerebral cortex is the gray outer layer of each hemisphere. The occurrence of sulci and gyri helps to increase the amount of this layer. Deeper within the cerebral hemispheres, the tissue is white. The gray matter represents cell bodies of the neurons. The white matter represents the axons. The areas of the cortex are associated with groups of related functions. For example, centers of speech and hearing are located along the lateral sulcus at the side of each hemisphere. Vision is centered at the rear in the area known as the occipital lobe. Sensory and motor functions are located along the central sulcus, which separates the frontal and parietal lobes of each hemisphere. The motor areas are located along the front side of the central sulcus in the frontal lobe. The sensory areas are located along the rear side of the central sulcus in the parietal lobe. Within the brain, there are interconnected hollow spaces filled with cerebrospinal fluid. These hollow spaces are known as ventricles. The right and left lateral ventricles are found in the cerebral hemispheres. The lateral ventricles are connected to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen, or foramen of Monro. The third ventricle is located in the forebrainstem. The fourth ventricle is in the hindbrainstem. The cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius is a short tube through the midbrainstem, which connects the third and fourth ventricles. The fourth ventricle is continuous with the narrow central canal of the spinal cord. The typical vertebra has a large opening called the vertebral or spinal foramen. Together, these foramina form the vertebral or spinal canal for the entire vertebral column. The spinal cord located within the spinal canal is continuous with the brainstem. The spinal cord travels the length from the foramen magnum at the base of the skull to the junction of the first and second lumbar vertebra. The spinal cord has 2 enlargements. One is the cervical enlargement, associated with nerves for the upper members. The other is the lumbosacral enlargement, associated with nerves for the lower members. A nerve is a bundle of neuron processes which carry impulses to and from the central nervous system. Those nerves arising from the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The spinal cord is a continuous structure which runs through the vertebral canal down to the lumbar region of the column. It's composed of a mass of central gray matter, or cell bodies of neurons, surrounded by peripheral white matter, or myelinated processes of neurons. The gray and white matter are thus considered columns of material. However, in a cross-section, this effect of columns is lost. A very narrow canal, called the central canal, is located in the center of the spinal cord. The central canal is continuous with the fourth ventricle of the brain. In the cross-section of the spinal cord, one can see a central H-shaped region of gray matter. Each arm of the H is called a horn, resulting in 2 posterior horns and 2 anterior horns. The connecting link is called the gray commissure. Since the gray matter extends the full length of the spinal cord, these horns are actually sections of the gray columns. The peripheral portion of the spinal cord cross-section consists of white matter. Since a column of white matter is a large bundle of processes, it's called a funiculus. The coverings of the central nervous system are skeletal and fibrous. The bones of the cranium form a spherical case around the brain. The cranial activity is the space enclosed by the bones of the cranium. The cranial cavity is the space enclosed by the bones of the cranium. The vertebrae with the vertebral foramina form a cylindrical case around the spinal cord. The overall skeletal structure is the vertebral column or spine. The vertebral or spinal canal is the space enclosed by the foramina of the vertebrae. The brain and spinal cord have 3 different membranes surrounding them called meninges. These coverings provide protection. The dura mater is a tough outer covering for the central nervous system. Beneath the dura mater is the subdural space, which contains a thin film of fluid. To the inner side of the dura mater and subdural space is a fine membranous layer called the arachnoid mater. It has fine spider web type threads which extend inward through the subarachnoid space to the pia mater. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The pia mater is a delicate membrane applied directly to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. It carries a network of blood vessels to supply the nervous tissues of the central nervous system. The paired internal carotid arteries and the paired vertebral arteries supply blood rich in oxygen to the brain. Branches of these arteries join to form a circle under the base of the brain. This is called the cerebral circle of Willis. From this circle, numerous branches supply specific areas of the brain. A single branch is often the only blood supply to that particular area. Such an artery is called an end artery. If it fails to supply blood to that specific area, that area will die, and this is called a stroke. The veins and venous sinuses of the brain drain into the paired internal jugular veins which carry the blood back towards the heart. The blood supply of the spinal cord is by way of a combination of 3 longitudinal arteries running along its length and reinforced by segmental arteries from the sides. A clear fluid called cerebrospinal fluid is found in the cavities of the CNS. Cerebrospinal fluid is found in the ventricles of the brain, the subarachnoid space, and the central canal of the spinal cord. CSF and its associated structures make up the circulatory system for the central nervous system. Choroid plexuses are special collections of arterial capillaries found in the roofs of the third and fourth ventricles of the brain. The choroid plexuses continuously produce CSF from the plasma of the blood. Blood flows through the arterial capillaries of the choroid plexuses. As CSF is produced by the choroid plexuses, it flows into all 4 ventricles. CSF from the lateral ventricles flows into the third ventricle, and then through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. By passing through 3 small holes in the roof of the fourth ventricle, CSF enters the subarachnoid space. From the subarachnoid space, the CSF is transported through the arachnoid villi, or granulations, into the venous sinuses. Thus, the CSF formed from arterial blood is then returned to the venous blood. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is that portion of the nervous system generally concerned with commands for skeletal muscles and other muscles made up of striated muscle tissue, as well as sensory information from the periphery of the body. The sensory information is carried to the central nervous system where it's processed. The peripheral nervous system carries commands from the CNS to musculature. A nerve is a collection of neuron processes together and outside the CNS. A fiber tract is a collection of neuron processes together and inside the CNS. The peripheral nervous system is made up of a large number of individual nerves. These nerves are arranged in pairs. Each pair includes one nerve on the left side of the brainstem or spinal cord and one nerve on the right side. The nerve pairs are in a series, each pair resembling and preceding from top to bottom. The peripheral nervous system nerves include cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The 12 pairs of nerves attached to the right and left sides of the brainstem are called cranial nerves. Each cranial nerve is identified by a Roman numeral in order from 1 to 12 and an individual name. For example, the fifth cranial nerve is known as the trigeminal nerve. Tri means three and Gemini means alike. Trigeminal meaning having three similar major branches. Attached to the sides of the spinal cord are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are named by the region of the spinal cord which the nerve is associated and an Arabic numeral within that region. For example, T5 is the fifth spinal nerve in the thoracic region. In the human body, every spinal nerve has essentially the same construction and components. By learning the anatomy of one spinal nerve, you can understand the anatomy of all spinal nerves. Make up various sympathetic ganglia of the body. These ganglia include the trunk or chain ganglia and the preaortic or central ganglia. Here we are speaking of postganglionic sympathetic neurons. The sympathetic nervous system innervates peripheral visceral organs, for example the sweat glands, and also central visceral organs, for example the lungs and the stomach. The neurons innervating the peripheral visceral organs are distributed to them by being included in the nerves of the peripheral nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system activates those visceral organs needed to mobilize energy for action, for example the heart, and deactivates those not needed, for example the gut. Cell bodies of the first neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system make up the intermediolateral gray columns in the sacral spinal cord at the S2, S3, and S4 levels. Cell bodies of the first neurons also make up 4 pairs of nuclei in the brainstem. These nuclei are associated with cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Here we are speaking of the preganglionic parasympathetic neurons. Cell bodies of the second neurons make up intramural ganglia within the walls of the visceral organs. These second neurons innervate the central visceral organs. They do not innervate peripheral visceral organs. Here we are speaking of the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons. The parasympathetic nervous system has the opposite effect on visceral organs from that of the sympathetic nervous system. For example, the heart is accelerated by the sympathetic nervous system and it's decelerated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Please take your seat so we can get started. A pathway is the series of nervous structures utilized in the transmission of an item of information. An example of a pathway is the reflex arc we previously discussed. The brain stem is continuous with the spinal cord. Together, the brain stem and the spinal cord are sometimes known as the neuraxis. A sensory pathway is a series of nervous structures used to transmit information from the body to the central nervous system. On arrival in the central nervous system, these pathways ascend or go up the neuraxis to the brain. A motor pathway is a series of nervous structures used to transmit information from the central nervous system to the body. The commands for motor action originate in the brain and descend or go down the neuroaxis to the appropriate spinal levels. From this point, the commands pass through the nerves to the effector organs. The human nervous system has several levels for control. The lowest level is the simple reflex arc. The highest level of control is the conscious level. From the lowest to the highest levels are several progressively higher levels such as the writing reflex. Thus, the processing of information and the transmission of commands are not haphazard, but very carefully monitored and controlled. All information input and all information output are monitored and evaluated. Motor pathways begin in the brain. They descend the neuraxis in bundles of a number of specific neuron processes called motor fiber tracts. Commands originating in the right half of the brain leave the central nervous system through peripheral nerves on the left side. Commands from the left half of the brain leave the central nervous system on the right side. Therefore, the right half of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left half of the brain controls the right side of the body. For example, the actions of the right hand are controlled by the left half of the brain. In those people who are right-handed, we refer to the left half of the brain as being dominant. A pyramidal motor pathway is primarily concerned with volitional or voluntary control of the body parts, in particular the fine movements of the hands. Because control is volitional, the pathways can be used for neurological screening and testing. These pathways are called pyramidal because their neuron processes contribute to the makeup of a pair of structures in the base of the brain known as the pyramids. An extrapyramidal pathway is primarily concerned with autonomic or non-volitional control of body parts for purposes of coordination. Extrapyramidal pathways use many intermediate relays before reaching the effector organs. The cerebellum of the brain plays a major role in the extrapyramidal pathways. The cerebellum helps to integrate patterned movements of the body. The body is continuously bombarded by types of information called stimuli. Those few stimuli which are consciously perceived in the cerebral hemispheres are called sensations. Those stimuli received throughout the body are called the general senses. Stimuli received by only single pairs of organs in the head, for example, the eyes, are called special senses. Examples of these would be smell and taste. The general senses in humans include pain, temperature, both warm and cold, touch, both light and deep, and proprioception, in other words, body sense, posture, tone, and tension. The special senses in humans include smell, also called olfaction, taste, also called gustation, vision, hearing, and equilibrium. The input from each special sensory receptor goes to its own specific area of the opposite cerebral hemisphere. The general sensory pathway is from the receptor organ via the peripheral nervous system nerves to the central nervous system. This general pathway then ascends fiber tracts in the neuraxis. The pathway ends in the central area of the cerebral hemisphere on the side opposite of the input. Molecules of various materials are dispersed or spread throughout the air we breathe. A special olfactory epithelium is located in the upper recesses of the nasal chambers in the head. Special hair cells in the olfactory epithelium are called chemoreceptors because they receive these molecules in the air. The information received by the olfactory hair cells is transmitted by way of the olfactory nerves, cranial nerves 1. It passes through these nerves to the olfactory bulbs and then into the opposite cerebral hemisphere. Here the information becomes the sensation of smell. Molecules of various materials are also dispersed or dissolved in fluids or saliva of the mouth. These molecules are from the food ingested or taken in. Organs known as taste buds are scattered over the tongue and in the rear of the mouth. Special hair cells in the taste buds are chemoreceptors to react to these molecules. The information received by the hair cells of the taste buds is transmitted to the opposite side of the brain by way of 3 cranial nerves, 7, 9, and 10. This information is interpreted by the cerebral hemispheres as the sensation of taste. Rays of light stimulate the receptor tissues of the eyeballs to produce the special sensation of vision. This includes both the sensation of vision or seeing and a variety of reactions known as the light reflexes. The actual reception of the light energy is a chemical reaction which in turn stimulates neuron endings. To appreciate the functioning of the eyes, some simple principles of optical physics have to be understood. By means of a lens system, light rays are bent and brought to the focal point for acute vision. This process is referred to as focusing. The focal length is the distance from the focal point to the center of the lens. The amount of bending or focusing depends upon the exact curvature of the lens system. The eyeball is the special sense organ which contains the receptor tissues. The eyeball is suspended in the orbit. The orbit is a skeletal socket of the skull which helps protect the eyeball. Various structures associated with the functioning of the eyeball are called the adnexa. The adnexa include the eyelids and the lacrimal system. In the main, the eyeball is a spherical bulb-like structure. Its anterior surface, transparent and more curved, is known as the cornea of the eyeball. The eyeball is a hollow structure. Its wall is made up of 3 layers known as coats or tunics. The outermost layer is white and very dense fibrous connective tissue. It's known as the sclera, scleral coat, or fibrous tunic. Its anterior portion is called the cornea. I already mentioned that the cornea is transparent and more curved than the rest of the sclera. The fixed curvature of the cornea enables it to serve as the major focusing device for the eyeball. The middle layer of the wall of the eyeball is known as the choroid coat, or the vascular tunic. This layer is richly supplied with blood vessels. It's also pigmented with a black material. The black color absorbs light rays and prevents them from reflecting at random. The inner layer of the wall of the eyeball is known as the retina, retinal coat, or internal tunic. The actual photoreceptor elements are located in the retina at the back and sides of the eyeball. These elements are the rods and cones. They constitute the nervous portion of the retina. In the anterior part of the eyeball, the retina continues as a non-nervous portion. The photoreceptors of the nervous portion of the retina contain chemicals known as visual pigments, or rhodopsin. The cones are more concentrated in the center at the back of the eyeball. The cones can register colors and are used for acute vision. However, cones require more intense light than do rods. The rods are distributed more toward the side of the nervous retina. Although the rods are capable of registering less intense light, rods perceive only black and white. If you look directly at an object, light from the object will fall in a small depression of the retina called the fovea centralis. The fovea centralis is at the posterior end of the eyeball, exactly opposite the centers of the cornea, pupil, and lens. The fovea centralis is found in a small yellow area of the retina called the macula lutea. The macula lutea is the area of the retina where vision is the sharpest. Fovea means small depression, centralis means center, macula means spot, and lutea means yellow. Associated with the rods and cones are the beginnings of neurons of the optic nerve. These neurons pass out of the eyeball at the posterior end in a point medial and superior to the fovea centralis. At the point of exit, there are no rods or cones. Therefore, it's called the blind spot or the optic disc. The anterior end of the choroid layer thickens to form a circular picture frame around the lens of the eyeball. This is also near the margin of the base of the cornea. The frame-like structure is called the ciliary body. It includes mostly radial muscle fibers which form the ciliary muscle. The lens is suspended in place by ligaments or fibers of the ciliary zonule. These ligaments connect the margin or the equator of the lens with the ciliary body. The lens is located in the center of the anterior of the eyeball, just behind the cornea. The lens is biconvex. This means that it has 2 outwardly curved surfaces. The anterior surface is flatter or less curved than the posterior surface. The lens is transparent and elastic. As one grows older, the lens becomes less and less elastic. The ligaments maintain a tension upon the lens. This tension keeps the lens flatter and allows the lens to focus on distant objects. When the ciliary muscle contracts, the tension on the lens is decreased. The decreased tension allows the lens to thicken. The greater thickness increases the anterior curvature and allows close objects to be seen clearly. The process of focusing the lens for viewing close objects clearly is called accommodation. The process of accommodation is accompanied by a reduction in the pupil size as well as a convergence of the 2 central lines of sight, or the axes of the eyeball. Another structure formed from the anterior portion of the choroid layer is the iris. The iris is located between the lens and the cornea. The pupil is the hole in the middle of the iris. The size of the pupil is controlled by the radial and circular muscles of the iris. The radial muscles are dilators. The circular muscles are constrictors. By changing the size of the pupil, the iris controls the amount of light entering the eyeball. The iris may have many different colors. The actual color is determined by multiple genes. The space between the cornea and the lens is called the anterior cavity. The space between the cornea and the iris is called the anterior chamber. The space between the iris and the lens is called the posterior chamber. Both chambers of the anterior cavity are filled with a fluid called the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor is secreted into the chambers by the ciliary body. It drains into the encircling canal of Schlemm, located at the angle between the cornea and the iris. This angle is called the iridocornealis angle. Behind the lens is a jelly-like material called the vitreous. The orbit is the cavity in the upper facial skull which contains the eyeball and its adnexa. The orbit is open anteriorly. The floor of the orbit is generally horizontal. Its medial wall is generally vertical and straight from front to back. Since the lateral wall and roof converge to the rear, the orbit is a cone-like cavity. In the facial skull, the orbit is surrounded by a number of specific spaces. Superiorly, the roof of the orbit is also the floor of the anterior cranial cavity, where the frontal portion of the brain is. Just medial to the medial wall are the structures of the nasal chamber. Inferiorly, the floor of the orbit is also the roof of the maxillary sinus. Laterally, the wall of the orbit is the inner wall of the temporal fossa, a depression on each side of the skull where a fan-shaped chewing muscle, or temporalis muscle, is attached. The adnexa are the various structures associated with the eyeball. Among the adnexa are the extrinsic ocular muscles, which move the eyeball within the orbit. Each eyeball has associated with it 6 muscles made up of striated muscle fibers. 4 of these muscles are straight from the rear of the orbit into the eyeball. They are therefore known as the recti muscles. Rectus means straight. Each name indicates the position of the muscles in relationship to the eyeball. For example, lateralis rectus muscle means on the outer side. Superior rectus muscle means above. Medial rectus muscle means on the inner side, and inferior rectus muscle means below. In addition, there are 2 muscles that approach the eyeball from the medial side and are known as the superior oblique and inferior oblique muscles. Attached to the margins of the orbit in front of the eyeball are the upper and lower eyelids. These are called palpebra in Latin or blepharon in Greek. These have muscles for opening and closing the eyelids. The eyelashes, or cilia, are special hairs of the eyelids which help protect the eyeball. The margins of the eyelids have special oil to prevent the loss of fluids from the area. The inner lining of the eyelids is continuous with the conjunctiva, a membrane over the anterior surface of the eyeball. The conjunctiva must be kept moist and clean at all times. To do this, a lacrimal apparatus is associated with the eyelids. In the upper outer corner of the orbit is a lacrimal gland which secretes a lacrimal fluid, or tears, into the junction between the upper eyelid and the conjunctiva. By the motion of the eyeball and the eyelids, or blinking, this fluid is moved across the surface of the conjunctiva to the medial inferior aspect. Here the lacrimal fluid is collected and delivered into the nasal chamber by the nasolacrimal duct. The eyebrow, or supercilium, is a special group of hairs just above the orbit. The eyebrow serves to keep rain and sweat away from the eyeball. Neurons carry information from the photoreceptors of the nervous retina. They leave the eyeball at the blind spot. At the optic nerve, or second cranial nerve, the neurons pass to the rear of the orbit. There, the optic nerve exits through the optic canal into the cranial cavity. Beneath the brain, the optic nerves from both sides join to form the optic chiasma, in which half of the neurons from each optic nerve cross to the opposite side. From the optic chiasma, right and left optic tracts proceed to the brain proper. The human ear serves 2 major special sensory functions: hearing and equilibrium. The stimulus for hearing is sound waves. The stimulus for equilibrium is gravitational forces. The sound stimulus is transmitted in a variety of ways. Regardless of the actual transmission method, the sound stimulus is unchanged. Sound may be transmitted as airborne waves, mechanical oscillations or vibrations, fluid-borne pressure pulses, or electrical impulses along the neurons to and in the brain. The human ear has 3 major parts. Each part serves a specific function in the transmission and reception of the sound stimulus. The 3 parts are known as the external or outer ear, the middle ear, and the internal or inner ear. The external ear begins on the outside of the head in the form of a funnel-shaped auricle called pinna. Actually serving as a funnel, the auricle directs airborne sound waves into the external auditory meatus. The external auditory meatus is a tubular canal extending into the temporal portion of the skull. At the inner end of the external auditory meatus is the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane, also called eardrum, is a circular membrane separating the external auditory meatus from the middle ear cavity. The tympanic membrane vibrates or mechanically oscillates in response to airborne sound waves. On the medial side of the tympanic membrane is the middle ear cavity. The middle ear cavity is a space within the temporal bone. The auditory ossicles are three very small bones which form a chain across the middle ear cavity. Ossicle means small bone. They join the tympanic membrane with the medial wall of the middle ear cavity. In order, the ossicles are named as malleus, incus, and stapes. The malleus is attached to the tympanic membrane. A sound stimulus is transmitted from the tympanic membrane to the medial wall of the middle ear cavity by way of the ossicles. The ossicles vibrate in response to the sound stimulus. The auditory tube or eustachian tube is a passage connecting the middle ear cavity with the nasopharynx. The auditory tube maintains equal air pressure on two sides of the tympanic membrane. The middle ear cavity is associated with other spaces in the skull. The thin roof of the middle ear cavity is the floor of part of the cranial cavity. The middle ear cavity is continuously posterior with the mastoid air cells via the antrum and upper posterior recess of the middle ear cavity. The bony labyrinth or maze is a complex cavity within the temporal bone. It has three semicircular canals, a vestibule or hallway, and a snail-shaped cochlear portion. The membranous labyrinth is a hollow tubular structure suspended within the bony labyrinth. Endolymph is a fluid filling the space with the membranous labyrinth. The perilymph is a fluid filling the space between the membranous labyrinth and the bony labyrinth. These fluids are continuously formed and drained away. The cochlea is a spiral structure associated with hearing. It has 2.5 turns. Its outer boundaries are formed by the snail-shaped portion of the bony labyrinth. The central column or axis of the cochlea is called the modiolus. Extending from this central column is a spiral shelf of bone called the spiral lamina. A fibrous membrane called the basilar membrane or basilar lamina connects the spiral lamina with the outer bony wall of the cochlea. The basilar membrane forms the floor of the cochlear duct, the spiral portion of the membranous labyrinth. Within the cochlear duct there is a structure on the basilar membrane called the organ of Corti. The organ of Corti has hairs which are the sensory receptors for the special sense of hearing. Within the bony cochlea, the space above the cochlear duct is known as the scala vestibuli, and the space below is known as the scala tympani. Since the scalae are joined at their apex, they form a continuous channel, and the connection between them is called the helicotrema. Between the middle ear cavity and the scala vestibuli is an oval window called the fenestra vestibuli. It's filled with the footplate of the stapes. Between the middle ear cavity and the scala tympani is a round window called the fenestra cochlea. It's covered or closed by a membrane. The sound stimulus is transferred from the stapes to the perilymph of the scala vestibuli. Here the stimulus is transmitted as a pressure pulse in the fluid. In response, the basilar membranes of the cochlea vibrates or mechanically oscillates. Only selected portions of the basilar membrane vibrate at any one time, depending on the frequency of the sound stimulus. The hair cells of the organ of Corti at that particular location are mechanically stimulated. This stimulation is transferred to the neurons of the acoustic nerve, the cranial nerve 8A. The acoustic nerve passes out of the modiolus into the internal auditory meatus of the temporal bone. From here, it enters into the cranial cavity and goes to the brain. Posture is the specific alignment of the body parts at any given time. Humans can assume an infinite variety of postures. However, the truly erect posture is unique to humans. Equilibrium is the state of balance of the body. An erect standing human has a highly unstable equilibrium and therefore can easily fall. Through a variety of sensory inputs and postural reflexes, the body is maintained in its erect posture. The primary sensory input for equilibrium consists of gravitational forces. This input is received by the membranous labyrinth within the internal ear. The gravitational forces are of two types: static, when the body is standing still, and kinetic, when the body is moving in either linear or angular directions. The specific portions of the membranous labyrinth involved are the two sac-like structures, the sacculus and the utriculus. Each of these two structures has an area of special hair cells called the macula. In addition, there are 3 semicircular ducts located within the osseous semicircular canals of the temporal bone of the skull. Each semicircular duct has a crista, a little ridge of hair cells across the axis of the duct. All of the various sensory inputs related to the maintenance of equilibrium and posture are integrated within the brain as body sense. Correct information is sent to the muscles of the body by means of specific postural reflexes in order to maintain the proper posture. The sacculus and the utriculus are 2 sac-like portions of the membranous labyrinth. They're filled with endolymph. On the wall of each sac is a collection of special hair cells known as the macula, which serves as a receptor organ for static and linear kinetic gravitational forces. The saccular macula and the utricular macula are oriented at more or less right angles to each other. For the pair of maculae in the membranous labyrinth of the right side, there's a corresponding pair in the labyrinth on the left side. Information from all of these maculae is sent to the brain for continuous sensing of the position of the head in space. Extending from and opening into the utriculus are 3 hollow structures called the semicircular ducts. Since the utriculus completes the circle for each duct, the ducts act as if they were complete circles. 2 of the ducts are vertically oriented, one anterior and one posterior. The third duct is essentially horizontal. The 3 ducts are all oriented at right angles to each other. In addition, the 3 ducts of one membranous labyrinth are matched or paired by the 3 ducts of the opposite membranous labyrinth. Each semicircular duct ends with an enlargement where it opens into the utriculus. This enlargement or swelling is called an ampulla. The crista is at a right angle to the axis of the duct. Movement of the endolymph within the duct, caused by movement of the head in space, deforms or bends the hairs of the crista in specific directions. These are responses to linear and/or angular kinetic gravitational forces. The vestibular nerve, cranial nerve 8, carries all this information from the macula and crista to the brain. The vestibular and auditory nerves are contained in the same fibrous sheath from the membranous labyrinth to the brain. Within the brain, the vestibular and auditory nerves separate into different pathways. The human nervous system can be thought of as a series of steps or levels. Each level is more complex than the level just below. No level is completely overpowered by upper levels, but each level is controlled or guided by the next upper level as it functions. The simplest and lowest level of control is the reflex arc. The reflex arc operates essentially on the level of the sensory input. Segmental reflexes produce a wider reaction to a stimulus than the reflex arc. For this purpose, the nervous system is organized more complexly. Thus, information spreads to a wider area of the central nervous system. We can observe a greater reaction to the stimulus. In the hind brainstem are to be found a number of nuclei, or collections of neuron cell bodies, which monitor and control the activities of the visceral functions of the body, such as respiration and heartbeat. And within the substance of the brainstem is a diffuse system called the reticular formation. Reticular means network. This reticular formation has a facilitatory or excitatory area and an inhibitory area. These areas monitor and control general body functions, including sleep. In the fore brainstem is a major collection of nuclei, all together called the thalamus. The thalamus is a primary relay for information going to and from the cerebrum and cerebellum. In the lowest animals, the thalamus represents the highest level of nervous control. The cerebellum has been greatly developed with many functional subdivisions. Altogether, it is one of the most important integrators of motor activity of the body. In humans, the highest level of nervous control is localized in the cerebrum. It's at this level that conscious sensation and volitional motor activity are localized. Even so, we can clearly designate 3 levels of control within the cerebrum: visceral, patterned, or volitional. The visceral or vegetative level is primarily concerned with visceral activities of the body as related to fight or flight, fear, and other emotions. The patterned or stereotype motor actions are activities of the bodies that are standardized and repetitive in nature. An example of a stereotype pattern of muscle activity would be the sequence of muscle actions involved in walking. The volitional level is the highest and newest level of control. Here, unique, brand new solutions can be created.